On November 5th, 2009, at Fort Hood in Texas, an Army major named Nidal Hasan gunned down 14 innocent persons, including an unborn child, while shouting, "Allahu Akbar." Prior to this terror attack, and apparently folks in the gallery find it amusing, a terrorist murdering 14 innocent souls. Prior to this terror attack, federal officials were aware that Hasan had attempted to contact al-Qaeda and exchanged numerous emails with the terrorist Anwar al-Awlaki. A self-professing soldier of Allah, Hasan had also worried many colleagues with his promotion of an extreme or radical interpretation of Islam. Yet, for fear of being branded as politically incorrect or otherwise, they did nothing. Then, after the fact, the Obama administration classified these terrorist killings as mere workplace violence. In January of 2010, the Department of Defense issued a report entitled "Protecting the Force: The Lessons from Fort Hood." The report did not mention Hasan by name, nor did it use the terms Islam or jihad. I would like nothing more than to speak with a government official about these bizarre decisions and omissions, and about the pattern that has characterized 7 years of the Obama administration, especially in light of the most recent terror attack in Orlando by a radicalized man who'd been interviewed 3 times by the FBI, and yet whose terror attack was not prevented. Indeed, this subcommittee invited 2 such witnesses: John Carlin, an Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice's National Security Division, and Michael Steinbach, the Executive Assistant Director for the FBI's National Security Branch. Both members of the Obama administration have refused to appear before this Senate hearing. 3 months after Fort Hood, in February 2010, the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review made 0 references to Islam, radical or otherwise. Again, this subcommittee would have appreciated speaking with government officials about this deliberate omission. Again, they have refused to appear or testify. In 2011, the group Muslim Advocates sent a letter to the Obama administration claiming the federal government had somehow become infected with, quote, false and highly offensive training materials about Muslims and Islam, and demanding that, quote, such bigoted and distorted materials be purged. And I would note that was their word, not mine. Purged. And is also advocating for the creation of an interagency task force to address this problem. In a lightning quick response, a rather unusual occurrence in our bloated bureaucracy, current CIA Director John Brennan, then the President's Homeland Security Advisor, agreed to create such a task force and claimed that the federal government had indeed produced, quote, offensive training that urgently needed to be dealt with in order to, quote, reflect the vision that the President has put forward. Yet again, this subcommittee would like to discuss this critical issue of national security with the relevant officials from the Obama administration. After all, should it really be the top concern of counterterrorism whether their efforts, quote, offend anyone rather than whether they work and keep Americans safe? Yet no one from this administration is even willing to show up and defend their scrubbing of anti-terror materials. Let's take several more. In November 2011, the Department of Homeland Security released its Domestic Terrorism and Homegrown Extremism Lexicon. It made no reference to Islamic terrorism, despite being, on its face, an alleged lexicon that included anarchist extremists, animal rights extremists, environmental extremists, and racist skinhead extremists. Yet somehow, radical Islamic extremists were nowhere mentioned in the FBI's supposed lexicon. Similarly, the FBI's counterterrorism analytical lexicon makes no reference to Islam, radical Islam, jihad, or any other such term. By way of comparison, the 9/11 Commission report, released in 2004, mentioned jihad 126 times and Islam 322 times. Even worse, in March 2012, under pressure from advocacy groups, the FBI purged 876 documents from its training materials at the behest of 3 unidentified quote-unquote experts. Some of the purged materials, according to the FBI, were, and here's that word again, quote, offensive. One article was purged because it was, quote, highly inflammatory and inaccurately argued that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. It should come as no surprise that I and many others are concerned by this, given that I've introduced a bill in this Senate to designate the Muslim Brotherhood for what it is, a terrorist organization. Hamas, after all, is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and is a terrorist organization that openly celebrates murdering women and children. The Obama administration, of course, has declined to appear and explain its policies. In 2014, the president stated that ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, was, quote, not Islamic. Again, the Islamic State is somehow not Islamic. Because, according to President Obama, quote, no religion condones the killing of innocents. Somehow no one has told that to the terrorists. Also in 2014, a former White House counterterrorism strategist claimed that the federal government, quote, cannot directly address the warped religious interpretations of groups like ISIL because of the constitutional separation of church and state. U.S. officials, he argued, quote, are prohibited from engaging in debates about Islam. That's more than a little troubling. Are government officials, under the terms of this administration's policy, prohibited from debating anything about Islam, from confronting Islamism, the radical theology that mandates the forcible murder or forcible submission to Sharia of the infidels? This committee deserves to hear an explanation of that. Let's finish with some more recent examples. This year alone, the Obama administration has twice purged mentions of ISIS and Islamic terrorism from highly significant public records. One involving French President Hollande's remarks about the Paris terror attacks, and the other involving the terrorist 9/11 call during the horrific Orlando attack. The administration was forced to abruptly reverse course when the public outcry became too great. Around the same time, the Homeland Security Advisory Council was admonishing DHS personnel in a report about countering violent extremism to reject, quote, religiously charged terminology such as jihad, Sharia, takfir, and ummah. Does anyone notice a trend here? A consistent effort by this administration to scrub any reference to radical Islamic terrorism, to pretend that the threat does not exist. And tragically, as a consequence of that, over and over again, we have instances where the administration has ample evidence of radical Islamic terrorists, whether it is the Boston bombers or Nidal Hassan, whether it is the terrorist in San Bernardino or the terrorist in Orlando. The administration has had over and over again ample evidence to step in and prevent these terror attacks. But the consequence of the willful blindness of a policy that as a matter of administration policy refuses to acknowledge the threat means over and over again this administration has allowed the threats to go forward. We cannot combat and defeat radical Islamic terrorism without acknowledging it exists and directing our resources to stopping it. And an Orwellian doublethink that seeks to excerpt any reference to it, as the administration did to the president of France, or erase pledges of allegiance to ISIS, as the administration did with the Orlando terrorist, is counterproductive to keeping this country safe. That should be the number one obligation of the Commander-in-Chief. It should be the focus of this administration, and the purpose of this subcommittee hearing is to assess the degree to which the administration is willfully turning a blind eye to radical Islamic terrorism and the consequences for the safety and security of the American people. Senator Cruz.
Chairman Cruz, I appreciate this opportunity for the first hearing of this calendar year. In my view, today's hearing presents the American people with a false choice. Its very premise suggests that we can either keep America safe or preserve our fundamental values, and I reject that premise. We can and must defeat terrorism without sacrificing our constitutional principles. And to compromise these principles and blame over 1 billion Muslims for the twisted actions of an extremist few only serves to divide Americans, to alienate the Muslim world, and to legitimate the murderous groups who falsely claim to speak for Islam. This makes us less safe. To truly tackle and destroy the extremist ideologies that lead fanatics to do us harm, we will be best defended by maintaining our values of openness, tolerance, and religious freedom. We cannot fight radicalization with further radicalization. As we hold today's hearing, the country is still trying to make sense of a tragic attack in Orlando. 16 days ago, a man entered the Pulse nightclub armed with dangerous weapons and massacred 49 innocent people, injuring 50 more, leaving our nation and world shaken. These acts of violence are sadly all too familiar and leave us asking why this Congress refuses to take simple actions to prevent them. The particular form of violent pathology Omar Mateen undertook will continue to be the subject of scrutiny in days and weeks to come, but there are a few base facts I want to assert. First, as a nation, we are not at war with the religion of Islam. A deranged murderer's invocation of Islam was a hollow attempt to justify his rampage by cloaking it in the legitimacy of religion. Second, we know that ISIS is trying to falsely characterize the United States and our allies as being at war with Islam. And ISIS is trying to characterize itself as the legitimate heir of the Prophet Muhammad. ISIS is not Islamic. It is a perverted misinterpretation of one of the world's great religions. It is a death cult that has killed more Muslims than Christians, and the extremists who call themselves ISIS neither practice Islam nor speak for it. No religion condones the massacring of thousands of innocent people, and both faithful Muslims and theological leaders around the world have denounced ISIS as the terror group that it is and disclaimed its deviant interpretation of their religion. As you raise the concern or question about whether President Obama and his administration are committed to combating and defeating ISIS, let me briefly recount that the president has also condemned the threat of ISIS and set about defeating it, not with debates over a few words, but with decisive action. The United States and its coalition of allied partners has carried out more than 13,000 airstrikes and killed more than 25,000 ISIS fighters and more than 120 ISIS leaders. Over the past year, ISIS has lost more than half the territory it once controlled in Iraq and nearly a quarter in Syria. The United States successfully built a 66-nation coalition to fight ISIS, and these partners, including 19 Muslim-majority states and organizations, are committed to eliminating the threat posed by ISIS and have contributed across a wide range of ways to the effort to combat ISIS in the Middle East and in Iraq and Syria and beyond. Third, there's over 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, including millions who are American citizens and are interwoven into the fabric of our nation. They are doctors and lawyers and scholars, service members, police officers, members of Congress, parents, colleagues, and friends. And over the last several months, I have been deeply disturbed by inflammatory rhetoric directed towards Muslims and the way this disparagement has infected our political discourse in the United States. Our Muslim American citizens and neighbors share our stake in the nation's security and our desire to be free from violence and hate. Last, we know that our nation can defeat terrorists without betraying our values. Ensuring that our national security agencies are fully funded and that they are able to engage in clear-eyed pursuit of all threats and promoting what are demonstrated to be effective law enforcement techniques without prejudice are the best ways to promote our safety. I utterly reject the notion that there is some sort of political correctness preventing us from fighting our enemies. Any suggestion the administration is simply too polite to pursue threats posed to this country is disrespectful to the brave men and women who devote their lives to keeping us safe. Meanwhile, politicians in America and Europe who cast a broad brush blame on quote-unquote radical Islam feed the sense of an isolated and aggrieved Muslim community which only seeks to empower ISIS. Let me submit for the record, if I could, a wide range of different documents, but first, a statement of principles signed by dozens of foreign policy leaders, including former secretaries Madeleine Albright, Michael Chertoff, and Chuck Hagel, which correctly states, and I quote, "Religious bans and tests are un-American and have no place in our refugee and immigration policies." Mr. Chairman, I have a long list of statements I'd like to submit for the record from the ranking member, Senator Leahy, from Centrelink, from the Muslim Public Affairs Council, Amnesty International, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, recent New York Times article by Aziz Ansari, and a Washington Post article by General Petraeus. I would assume those will be admitted without objection.
Without objection.
As to the empty seats before us and your opening comments, Mr. Chairman, it is my understanding this hearing was scheduled with a bare minimum of notice and no consultation with the invited witnesses from the administration regarding their schedules. It is my expectation they are busy keeping our country safe, and as you surely appreciate from your work at the Justice Department, asking witnesses here to speak about the ongoing investigation into the Orlando incident would not have produced any productive testimony. And I will note that the Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, will be before this exact committee in 2 days, prepared to answer questions. Let me close by quoting what I've just submitted for the record, an article from General David Petraeus. Quote, "Those who flirt with hate speech against Muslims should realize they are playing directly into the hands of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Demonizing an entire religious faith and its adherents not only runs contrary to our most cherished and fundamental values as a country, it is also corrosive to our vital national security interests and ultimately to our success in this war. I look forward to what I hope can be a productive conversation about our national security, our civil liberties, and respect for Muslim Americans. Thank you."
I thank my friend from Delaware for his comments. I would note that Senator Coons suggested that perhaps it was scheduling issues that prevented the government's witnesses from attending. This hearing was noticed two weeks ago, and indeed just a few days ago we received a letter from the Department of Justice that did not claim any scheduling conflicts, simply stated that the Department of Justice declined to attend. I would suggest that was not inadvertence. I would note as well that Senator Coons followed the lead of President Obama in invoking 2 shibboleths, neither one of which this hearing concerns. The first one, he said, is that we have no war with Islam. That is certainly correct. There are millions of peaceful Muslims across the face of the globe, and President Obama and Senate Democrats do grave disrespect to them when they suggest some sort of equivalence between peaceful Muslims and radical Islamic terrorists. To suggest that confronting radical Islamic terrorists is somehow hostile to peaceful Muslims bears no bearing on reality. I would note as well that Senator Cruz, like President Obama, suggested this is just about uttering a few words, radical Islamic terrorism. No one has suggested the words radical Islamic terrorism are some magic incantation that saying them out loud will suddenly make it go away. But you cannot fight an enemy you do not acknowledge, that you pretend does not exist, and that you refuse to confront. It's not simply that President Obama, like Senate Democrats, won't say radical Islamic terrorism. It is that they have engaged in a, quote, purge to erase any focus on radical Islamic terrorism. Senator Cruz mentioned a minute ago that we are, quote, still trying to make sense of the terror attack in Orlando. One is only still trying to make sense of it if one ignores the actions and words of the terrorist. A terrorist who pledged his allegiance to ISIS and whose pledge of allegiance was edited out of his 9/11 call by the Obama administration. An action that would make George Orwell proud. It only makes no sense if you do not listen to the promises to murder as many innocents as possible. And the purpose of this hearing is to focus on the connections between that policy of willful blindness, of insisting there is no such thing as radical Islamic terrorism, and the repeated failures of this administration to prevent terrorism. When the Orlando terrorist tells his coworkers that he's affiliated with Al-Qaeda, when the Orlando terrorist is interviewed 3 times by the FBI, when the Orlando terrorist has connections to an American suicide bomber, when the Orlando terrorist's father is publicly proclaiming on YouTube his support for the Taliban, any administration focused on fighting radical Islamic terrorism would have watched that individual very, very closely to prevent the terror attack that he was giving signal after signal after signal was a real risk. And Orlando is not the only instance. Over and over and over again, this administration has the warning signs, but because of political correctness doesn't act on them, and the result is innocent Americans are killed. Now, at this point, I would like to recognize Mr. Carlin and Mr. Steinbeck to provide their testimony, but they have refused to attend. So with that, I will invite the members of the second panel to please come forward. And each of you will be sworn in momentarily. And while you're coming forward, I will begin by introducing each of the members of the second panel. The first witness is Dr. M. Zuhdi Jasser, who is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy in Phoenix, Arizona. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the Medical College of Wisconsin, Dr. Jasser is a former commissioner of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he served as a medical officer in the United States Navy. Dr. Jasser is currently in private practice in Phoenix, specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology. Ms. Farhan Akara is the president and executive director of Muslim Advocates in Oakland, California. A graduate of Wellesley College and Cornell Law School, she has previously served as counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and has worked as a litigation associate with several prominent Washington, D.C. law firms. Mr. Philip Haney is a former Customs and Border Protection officer in the Department of Homeland Security. Officer Haney completed several tours at the National Targeting Center near Washington, D.C., and he has won numerous awards and commendations for producing material that led to the identification of hundreds of terrorists. Having retired in July 2015, Mr. Haney now resides in Marietta, Georgia. Mr. Richard Cohen is an attorney and the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. A graduate of Columbia University and the University of Virginia School of Law, Mr. Cohen has previously testified before the House Committee on Homeland Security and has served on the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. Mr. Chris Gaubitz is a businessman, activist, and national security consultant based in Franklin County, Virginia. He has spent nearly a decade researching the threat to America posed by radical Islamic terrorism and developing expertise on the network of public and private organizations that terror groups rely on for support. Mr. Michael Gurman is a fellow with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School. A graduate of Wake Forest University and Northwestern University Law School, Mr. Gurman previously worked as a special agent of the FBI. He has taught at the National Defense University, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and spent several years with the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington Legislative Office. And Mr. Andrew McCarthy is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a contributing editor to National Review. A graduate of Columbia and the New York Law School, Mr. McCarthy served as a federal prosecutor for 18 years in the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He was the lead prosecutor in the terrorism case against the so-called Blind Sheik and 11 others convicted in 1995 of conspiring to wage a war of urban terrorism against the United States. Mr. McCarthy is the author of several books on terrorism and national security. And I would ask that each of you stand and raise your right hand. Do you affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated, and you are each sworn in, and we will begin the testimony with Dr. Jasser. Please be sure to turn your microphone off by pressing the button. Thank you. Is your microphone turned on? Okay. There should be a red light. The microphone doesn't seem to be working. If someone can try to address the technical issues. Perhaps you can use the adjoining microphone if that one is working.
Testing. Okay.
Much better, thank you.
Better. Thank you, Chairman Cruz, and members of the Subcommittee on Oversight Agency Action for this very important hearing on willful blindness. I'm president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, based in Phoenix, Arizona, and I request that my written statements be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
I'm here today, taking time away from my family, work, during this last week of our holiest month of Ramadan, a time of fasting and deep atonement, because I could not feel more strongly that our current national and agency direction in combating Islamist-inspired terrorism is deeply flawed and profoundly dangerous. As a devout Muslim who loves my faith and loves my nation, the de-emphasis of radical Islam is the greatest obstacle to both national harmony and national security. Wholesale denial of the truth by many in our government and political establishment is not only dishonest, it infantilizes Muslims while lying to the American people. But it actually emboldens the extremists on both sides of this debate, because the radicals or their cauldrons of Saudi Arabia and Iran end up speaking for Islam. I'm sorry to say that linking Islamism to Islam hands Islam to Saudi Arabia, to Iran, to the Egyptian Sharia state, to Pakistan, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, Islamic Republic of Iran. They do not speak for Muslims. So when you speak about 1.6 billion Muslims, you're actually handing the narrative to the regimes, not to the people of those governments. It empowers the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and its lobby to maintain their global form of petro-Islam as the only form of Islam. And the OIC lobby is the proverbial elephant in the room. If we are on the side of Muslim dissidents, then we would be on the side of having this debate. America was formed on a debate versus theocracy. I think we are adult enough to have this debate and do it functionally. without saying that we are having a debate in which we demonize 1.6 billion. I would tell you as a Muslim in this month of Ramadan that we demonize Muslims by letting the Islamists speak for our community. Neither Islam nor Muslims are monolithic. It is foolhardy in counterterrorism and counter-radicalization work to refuse to acknowledge the role of political Islam and its precursors. The majority of Americans are smart enough to understand that to say that the House of Islam has no problems is just as problematic as declaring that Islam and Muslims are the problem. A national security policy of refusing to say that Islam currently has a problem is dangerous. This surrender, which began just after 9/11, has charted a course towards failure. It has hamstrung our Homeland Security heroes from addressing any of the most central Islamist precursors of militant Islamists. If the agency actually emphasized the central role of radical Islam and its attendant ideologies, it would shift the entire axis of the agency toward one of beginning to actually address, expose, and engage the root cause of the theocratic strains of political Islam or Islamism, which would begin to make us safer. We can't both hold our Homeland Security accountable for precursors that then we tell them they can't even engage because all they're looking at is violent extremism. The only way to right this deep misdirection is to shift the center of access from countering violent extremism to countering violent Islamism. You can't hold them accountable to the precursors unless we identify what it is. Our American Islamic Forum for Democracy was founded on the premise that terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda are all symptoms of theocratic beliefs. We formed our organization to counter political Islam and separate mosque and state, just as the Founding Fathers fought against theocracy. In December, AIFD convened and helped launch a diverse Muslim reform movement that included over 15 organizations. It's a coalition of reformers in the US, Canada, and Europe that is not partisan, very bipartisan, that includes feminists, those who believe in gay rights, and all these issues of left to right, but yet came together to reject political Islam. And if every one of them was here today, they would tell you that the refusal to identify political Islam as the root cause and the conveyor belt that creates radical Islam is the greatest obstacle to the reforming the ideas that churn out these militants. Not one iota of our work would be possible in an environment where government agencies writ large are unwilling to understand and engage Muslim groups domestically and abroad on the diverse interpretations of these core terms, which I listed for you in my testimony. We should be able to have the maturity to engage what does ummah mean, what does Salafism, what does Wahhabism, what does Islamism mean, jihad. Not to engage those terms is not only dishonest, but it actually marginalizes the very Muslims you want to and you claim to respect. In fact, the administration has not done so because of those who they engage in their advisory circles, like Mariotti from MPAC, and subversively the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is not supposed to engage the government, but yet does because of its influence and its connection to, I would tell you, the OIC lobby in Washington. As an American Muslim who loves my faith and country, I ask that any official and unofficial U.S. government moratorium on the use and understanding of the following terms that I discussed be immediately lifted. Any security apparatus unable or unwilling to connect the dots between nonviolent and violent manifestation of these ideologies is leaving us bare and will continue to miss the signs of radicalization. Fort Hood, Boston Marathon, Chattanooga, San Bernardino, and likely Orlando will show that in every one of these cases, it is abundantly obvious that had security agencies honed in on the continuum of political Islam, theocratic Islam, support of the Taliban, support of many of these other organizations, that ultimately they would have had these individuals on their radar. But they didn't because they're waiting for that final moment when they become violent. I want to end with some recommendations. We need to stop hiding behind offending the OIC and their regimes, which put Muslims like me in prisons every day across the Middle East. We need to transition from the center of gravity of countering violent Islamism, countering violent extremism, to a center of gravity of countering violent Islamism. The U.S. government and public discourse must include a broad spectrum of ideologically diverse voices in the Muslim community, and not just one apologetic voice that doesn't see a problem and is enabling the continued radicalization of our community. It is time to stop engaging Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in government and media and recognize their misogynist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, and anti-American problematic underbelly and underpinnings. We must at least recognize that they are not the only voice for American Muslims, and we must make women's issues and freedom of conscience a litmus test. These groups, when pressed, will fail. It's time to stop giving credence to the Islamic narrative of the OIC dictatorships over the opinions of Muslims here in America that believe in our liberty and freedom. I ask that you open investigation into CARE's radical ties and other Islamists and into their extensive network of foundations and poorly hidden branches of many of these Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups. And I ask that you no longer fear offending us by using the terms that we use when we debate these issues within our own communities. Those oppressed by Islamism, including mostly Muslims, depend on your honesty. Homeland Security depends on your honesty in order that the American people hold them accountable to the natural precursors of violent Islamism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jasser. Ms. Kara.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, while working for then U.S. Senator Russ Feingold, my colleagues and I learned that a plane hijacked by terrorists was heading for the Capitol. I still vividly recall what it was like to run out of the Hart Senate office building, fearing for the safety of my friends, my colleagues, and my family. 3 weeks later, our Senate office received mail contaminated with deadly anthrax spores. My colleagues and I were put on powerful antibiotics for several months to counteract possible anthrax exposure. You see, Mr. Chairman, I understand on a deeply personal level what it feels like to fear harm and to be under attack. I resolved then to do my part to ensure that violent extremists, regardless of race, religion, or ideology, never succeed in their mission to destroy the values that make our nation great: freedom, justice, and equality for all. Mr. Chairman, Senator Coons, and members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today on how we can do better to keep our nation safe while upholding our nation's founding values. Days after 9/11, President George Bush called on the nation to uphold the values of America. He said, "No one should be singled out for unfair treatment or unkind words because of their ethnic background or religious faith." At a dark moment in our nation's history, President Bush comforted the American people by assuring them that we are stronger together. Nearly 15 years after 9/11, we are experiencing another dark moment. Candidates for President of the United States have said that law enforcement agencies should patrol and secure Muslim neighborhoods, that there should be a national registry for Muslims, that Muslims should carry special ID cards, and that all Muslims should be banned from entering the United States. This rhetoric makes our nation less safe. It makes us less safe because law enforcement's job is to find the needle in the haystack, a task that is made much more difficult when more stacks of hay are added to what the FBI director has called a nationwide search for the needles. We are also less safe because ISIS wants this to be a war against Muslims. Think about it. Do we really want to surrender our values, American values, to a death cult that has no respect whatsoever for human life and human dignity? Tragically, this dangerous political rhetoric has signaled to the public that it is okay to fear your Muslim neighbor. It has led, in the last several months, to a disturbing and unprecedented rise in hate crimes, murders, firebombings, shootings. In the last 7 months alone, there have been nearly 100 hate crimes against American Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim. These hate incidents are not mere statistics. They affect real people and families, most importantly, our children. Late last year, a mother told the story of her daughter, Sophia. Sophia began collecting all of her favorite things in a bag, fearing that the military would come to take her family away because they are Muslim. As sad as this story is, the response from U.S. Army veterans who heard this story was powerful and touching. Veterans posted images on social media of themselves in uniform with this message to this child: I will protect you. Since the tragic events in Orlando, Muslim advocates, along with Americans from all walks of life, have stood with our friends in the LGBTQ community. You see, we are not willing to give up on America. The idea that a group of people, diverse in every imaginable way, can form a lasting bond based on the shared principles of freedom, justice, and equality for all. Some would dismiss this as political correctness. To me, it is a belief in the power of what has made America great. We hope that our elected officials are not willing to give up on America, that you will do everything in your power to uphold and defend America's defining values and principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Haney.
Testing. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify here today. Also, I'd like to express my appreciation for the patience of the members on the committee and Senator Cruz while obtaining a copy of my written testimony. I'd like to start with a visual aid. This is the Homeland Security Advisory Council Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee Interim Report for 2016. My colleague referred to it earlier as suggesting that we should refrain from using words like Ummah or Jihad or Sharia. I would like to also show you another visual aid, and this is what is called the Words Matter memo that was published in January of 2008. And my story today is going to be what happened between these two documents, these two touchstone documents, 2008 and 2016, because it was during that period of time that what we know now as the Countering Violent Extremism policy came to be. And one of the expressions of that policy is what we heard all about in the media in a few days after the Orlando shootings, that Attorney General Lynch was going to release partial transcript of Orlando 911 calls with all references to Islamic terrorism removed. That is a condensation of what was actually happening behind the scenes with subject matter experts like myself who were sworn officers to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic. Between these two dates, 2008 and 2016, came what I call the first great purge, when I was ordered by the Department of Homeland Security headquarters to modify, a euphemism, removing all linking information out of approximately 820 text subject records in our law enforcement system that almost exclusively had to do with Muslim Brotherhood Network here in the United States. I was told to remove all unauthorized references to terrorism, that I was no longer allowed to do what are called memorandums of information received, what we call MOIRs, no more text records, no more research, and no more special treatment from the agency. But during that time, hundreds of law enforcement actions had been taken in the 3-year period when those 820 plus records were still in the law enforcement system. At exactly the same time, a controversial inaugural meeting took place on January 27th and 28th, 2010 between American Muslim leaders and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano, which was hosted by the Department of Homeland Security Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. It was controversial because several of the individuals attended the invitation-only conference in D.C. were known affiliates of at least two of the same Muslim Brotherhood front groups that had just been named as unindicted co-conspirators in the largest terrorism trial in the history of the United States, the Holy Land Foundation trial. Also that spring, at least 6 individuals with known affiliations to the Muslim Brotherhood front groups were appointed to the Countering Violent Extremism CVE Working Group, which was convened under the authority of the Homeland Security Advisory Council. I would like to show you now the logo of the Muslim Brotherhood, the moderate organization that this administration chose to ally itself with. Across the middle it says Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which means the brothers of the Muslim, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And at the bottom, taken from Quran 860, is the word Wa'ayuda, which means prepare yourselves to terrify your adversaries with steeds of war or weapons of war. That is the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. By the spring of 2010, we had come to the point that a CBP officer was literally linking information, meaning the dots, on Muslim Brotherhood-linked individuals from texts, while the administration was bringing the very same individuals into positions of influence to help create and implement our counterterrorism policy, both in the domestic arena and in the foreign policy arena, as evidenced in our overt support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Libya, Algeria, and Syria. Fast forward to August 30, 2011, when the Tablighi Jamaat court case that I worked on was approved by the Chief Counsel of Department of Homeland Security. And this is an icon of the Tablighi Jamaat movement, one of the largest in the world. Outside of the United States, it's called the Army of Darkness. I began a TDY assignment, meaning temporary duty, at the National Targeting Center in November of 2011. Within 6 months, we had instituted 1,200 law enforcement actions on the case that we had started. But in September of 2012, what I call the second Great Purge, when the administration removed 67 linking records out of that case that had direct ties both to the San Bernardino Mosque, Dar Ulum al-Islamiyah San Bernardino, and the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce down in Florida. In other words, the network that we had worked on at NTC is tied directly to the terrorist attacks that we've seen recently. At the end of my career, I was relieved of my service weapon. All access to text was cut off and suspended. My secret clearance was revoked, and I was sequestered for 11 months while the results of 3 simultaneous investigations from 3 different branches of the government were concluded. In July of 31 of last year, I retired honorably. In conclusion, the threat of Islamic terrorism does not just come from a network of armed organizations such as Hamas and ISIS, who are operating over there somewhere in the Middle East. In fact, branches of the same global network have been established here in America, and they are operating in plain sight, especially among those of us who have been charged with the duty of protecting our country from threats both foreign and domestic. The goal, meaning the strategy of the global Islamic movement, is based on Quran 2, 191 through 193, and is actually quite simple: to establish Sharia law everywhere in the world, including here in America. And there is an organization in the United States that's actively doing that. It's called the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. Very benign-sounding name, but in Arabic is Majama Fuqaha al-Sharia bi-Amrikiya, the group of lawyers implementing Sharia law in the United States, which is unconstitutional. The threat that we face today that continues growing despite the willful blindness of those who insist on pretending otherwise are not the tactical methods of violent extremism, terrorism, or even operative verbs such as jihad, but rather the historical and universally recognized Islamic strategic goal of implementing Sharia law everywhere in the world so that no other form of government, including the United States Constitution, is able to oppose its influence over the lives of those who must either submit to its authority, become second-class dhimmi citizens, or perish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Haney. Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. It's good to see you again. Our country faces threats of violent extremism from many sources. The horrible massacre at the Orlando gay nightclub earlier this month by a gunman pledging allegiance to ISIS is but the latest example. A year ago this month, it was the massacre of black churchgoers at the Charleston's Mother Emanuel Church by a white supremacist. 2 years ago this month, it was the murder of Las Vegas police officers by anti-government zealots who had been at Clive and Bundy's ranch. I would not take issue with the Obama administration's assessment that terrorism from those affiliated with or inspired by groups like ISIS represent the preeminent threat to our country. But I would point out that the threat of violent extremism from those blinded by racial hatred and rage at the government are serious ones as well. And while I would not go so far as to say that our government has been willfully blind to these latter threats, I would say that the record shows that both Republican and Democratic administrations, as well as the Congress, have not always given these latter threats the attention they deserve. The clearest example of this point comes from the history of the Domestic Terrorism Task Force that the Justice Department established after the Oklahoma City bombing. The task force was scheduled to have one of its regular monthly meetings on 9/11. But not only was that meeting canceled, the task force didn't meet again for 13 years as the threat associated with groups like Al-Qaeda came to dominate the government's attention. During this period, the number of hate and conspiracy-minded anti-government groups skyrocketed, and the level of violence from the radical right increased by a factor of 4. President Obama, of course, has been a particular lightning rod for the radical right. The day after he was elected, Stormfront, the world's leading neo-Nazi website, whose members have committed numerous murders, reported that it was getting 6 times its normal traffic. There are a lot of angry white people looking for answers, the site's publisher, a former Klansman, explained. When DHS released a report in 2009 assessing the likely backlash to the election of our first black president, the reaction from groups like the American Legion and members of Congress was so fierce that the report was withdrawn and the DHS unit that produced the report was allowed to wither. In 2014, the Justice Department finally revived its domestic terrorist task force after a white supremacist, Glenn Miller, killed 3 persons in Overland Park, Kansas, that he thought were Jewish. But still, there are indications that the threat of terrorism associated with groups like ISIS dominates the government's thinking. The Oklahoma City bombing was the first terrorist incident that President Obama mentioned in his speech at the White House summit of countering violent extremism in 2015. But it was virtually the only mention of radical right terrorism during the entire summit. 2 weeks after the Charleston massacre, the House Homeland Security Committee released a terror threat snapshot that didn't mention the Charleston killings. Congress has held multiple hearings, as it should, on the threat of terrorism associated with groups like Al-Qaeda. But as far as I know, neither the House nor the Senate has held hearings on terrorism directed at law enforcement officials in the West by government zealots such as the Bundys. In fact, members of Congress as well as state and local officials have actually sympathized with the Bundys at times. Again, the threat of extremist violence from individuals associated with or inspired by groups like ISIS is deadly serious, but it's not the only threat that we face. Furthermore, as the recent study by Duke University's Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security concluded, law enforcement's virtual singular focus on the threat of terrorism associated with groups like ISIS and its heavy-handed tactics risk fraying the bond of trust between law enforcement and Muslim communities that is so essential to effective law enforcement. President Bush said it best, "We are not at war with Islam. Muslim communities are part of the solution, not part of the problem." Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Mr. Gobbets.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I'm a national security consultant with a company called Understanding the Threat, or UTT. UTT is the only organization in America which trains law enforcement, intelligence professionals, military, and leaders on the threat from the global Islamic movement, the doctrine of jihadi groups, and how to identify, investigate, and dismantle them. At UTT, we hold the firm belief that in order to defeat the global Islamic movement, we must understand the enemy. U.S. military warfighting doctrine, specifically the intelligence preparation of the battlefield manual, states that war planners must begin all analysis of the enemy with who the enemy says they are and why they are fighting us. That becomes the basis for determining the enemy threat doctrine, which, in the case of jihadis, is Sharia. Universally, the enemy, jihadis, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, they all state that they are Muslims waging jihad in the cause of Allah to establish an Islamic state under Sharia. I'm going to discuss one jihadi group, the Muslim Brotherhood. Based on evidence entered into the largest terrorism financing and Hamas trial ever successfully prosecuted in U.S. history, and my own experience conducting undercover research with Hamas doing business as CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations. The Holy Land Foundation trial was adjudicated in Dallas, Texas in 2008 and identified CARE as a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine Committee, which is Hamas, a designated foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. government identified Hamas as an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. Documents entered into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial also revealed that ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, is a Muslim Brotherhood organization which financially supports Hamas, again, a designated terrorist organization. At the time it was indicted, the Holy Land Foundation was the largest Islamic charity in the United States and was convicted on 108 counts for funneling over $12 million to a foreign terrorist organization, which Hamas, which is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood creed states, quote, Allah is our goal, the Prophet is our guide, the Quran is our constitution, jihad is our way, and death for the glory of Allah is our greatest inspiration or ambition. The Muslim Brotherhood bylaws state, the Islamic nation must be fully prepared to fight the tyrants and the enemies of Allah as a prelude to establishing the Islamic State. Again, the Muslim Brotherhood agenda is no different than that of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The Muslim Brotherhood logo, as Mr. Haney showed, has two swords cradling a Quran with a reference to ayah or verse 860 of the Quran, which states, against them make ready your strength to the utmost of your power, including steeds of war, to strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah and your enemies. This verse is also referenced in the Al-Qaeda training manual, which was discovered in May 2000 by British investigators conducting a search of Al-Qaeda operative Anas al-Libi. Now, during my time conducting undercover research as an intern for Hamas, both at CARE in Maryland, Virginia, and Herndon, Virginia, and CARE National in Washington, D.C., I preserved documents that revealed Hamas doing business as CARE conspired to cover up fraud committed by one of their immigration attorneys, discussed coordinating with bin Laden and his associates, placed staffers and interns inside congressional offices, conspired to influence Congress, specifically Judiciary, Intelligence, and Homeland Security committees, impacted congressional districts, tasking each Hamas chapter office with influencing at least 2 legislators, and ordering books from the Saudi embassy on the virtue of jihad and martyrdom. Worked with a Muslim law enforcement officer to influence a major terrorism investigation by accessing a classified federal police database and tipping off the suspect. And the current administration in the U.S. national security apparatus continues to use leaders of Muslim Brotherhood groups like ISNA, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, CARE, and others to provide direct input into American foreign policy and domestic counterterrorism strategies. One of the results of this situation is to order the removal of terms like jihad and Sharia from our counterterrorism lexicon. I attended a convention in Columbus, Ohio in 2008 organized by Muslim Brotherhood group ISNA, and both the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice Federal Bureau of Prisons had recruitment and outreach booths. Both Congressman Keith Ellison and Andre Carson spoke at the Muslim Brotherhood event, and I witnessed Imam Siraj Wahaj, who is a vocal advocate for the implementation of Sharia and an unindicted co-conspirator in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, solicit donations for Hamas at CARE's annual banquet. Siraj Wahhaj was the first imam to offer prayers in Congress. Often when understanding the threat offers training to federal, state, and local law enforcement, Muslim Brotherhood groups work to intimidate the hosts of the training venues into canceling the training by threatening them with ties or with cries of Islamophobia and racism. Documents entered into the evidence into the Holy Land Foundation trial, entitled An Explanatory Memorandum, outline the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. Quote, the process of settlement is a civilization jihadist process, with all the word means. The Ikhwan must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. According to our enemy, the global Islamic movement, made up of many groups including Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, Tablighi Jamaat, Boko Haram, Hamas, Hezbollah, and many nation states including Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and many others, they all seek to impose Sharia. It is the blueprint from which they create their warfighting strategies. From a U.S. warfighting perspective, that naturally makes Sharia the enemy threat doctrine and adherence to Sharia a direct threat to the Republic. Until American leaders and national security professionals identify the threat and formulate policies and strategies that address adherence to this ideology, we will continue on our current path of defeat and eventually lose this war here at home, as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Gurman.
Chairman Cruz, Ranking Member Coons, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. Though it's clear our counterterrorism efforts are not as effective as they need to be to reduce political violence abroad and build public resiliency to terrorism at home, I respectfully disagree that the Obama administration's reluctance to use the term radical Islam is part of the problem. Policymakers and anti-Muslim advocacy organizations have ensured that radical Islam has remained a predominant part of the counterterrorism discourse since the 9/11 attacks. Congress has held more than a dozen hearings on the topic. Biased and factually flawed counterterrorism training materials produced by the FBI and the Departments of Justice, Defense, and Homeland Security vividly demonstrate these groups had substantial influence on the instruction these agencies provided over many years. The problem is not that there has been too little talk of radical Islam, but too much. I agree with President Obama that this rhetoric offends American values of equality, religious liberty, and free expression, and undermines the national unity and international cooperation necessary to effectively counter terrorist violence at home and abroad. This is not political correctness, it is factual correctness. Radical Islam is no more accurate or appropriate a descriptor of the source of terrorist violence committed by Muslims than the label radical Christianity would be to describe the violence perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan, the Army of God, or the Lord's Resistance Army. Radical Islam is a term that lacks objective meaning and doesn't withstand scholarly scrutiny. It only serves to stoke public fear, xenophobia, and anti-Muslim bigotry. It's been used broadly and arbitrarily to include disparate groups like Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Liberty City Seven. The fact that the first five are locked in armed conflict with one another and the last wasn't even a Muslim group doesn't seem to matter to those determined to see them as parts of a global conspiracy. More damaging, however, is when radical is used to smear Muslim civil rights groups, charities, and religious institutions in the same way the FBI did to labor organizers, civil rights, and peace activists during the Red Scares. As in the past, we err in thinking that we can improve our collective national security by undermining the security and liberty of some subset of fellow Americans. The skewed focus on terrorism committed by Muslims has clearly impacted law enforcement priorities, policies, and practices, which have disproportionately and indiscriminately targeted American Muslim communities with surveillance and infiltration, often to the exclusion of other violent threats. Half of the violent crimes, including a third of the roughly 15,000 homicides in the U.S. each year, go unsolved, even as the FBI investigates tens of thousands of false leads based on flawed radicalization theories. Meanwhile, if a 2011 triple homicide in Waltham, Massachusetts had been solved, Tamerlan Tsarnaev would not have been free to mastermind the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. In foreign policy, our inordinate focus on extremist ideology as the lens through which we evaluate many different civil wars blinds us to the true nature of these political conflicts and puts us on a path to perpetual war with predictable consequences to civil liberties, human rights, and the rule of law. Ideas cannot be killed and ideologies cannot be destroyed. Though we defeated Nazi Germany in World War II, my undercover work against neo-Nazis in the 1990s and the political assassination in Britain this month show fascism was not defeated. We respond appropriately to this threat by criminalizing the violent behavior, not by attempting to destroy an ideology. Today, Americans know little about ISIS except to be deathly afraid of it, which is exactly the way ISIS likes it. The flawed narrative that likens radical Islam to an ideological virus spreading unseen through vulnerable American Muslim communities is generating mutual distrust and animosity, leading to more strident calls for discriminatory policies and increasing anti-Muslim violence. This is self-defeating, as alienation and the experience of discrimination are often identified as the conditions that lead to greater radicalization. A counterterrorism discourse that pits Americans against one another and amplifies public fear will not improve our national security. We need to develop more effective strategies designed to build national unity and assuage public fear by providing objective information about the nature and scope of the many threats we face and the efficacy of the measures we're taking to address them. Protecting American values and our commitment to the rule of law is what will ensure our lasting security. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. McCarthy.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. As my submitted testimony summarizes, I worked on terrorism investigations, trials, and changes in counterterrorism law in various capacities over the years. It taught me that there are very much two sides to this story. The first Muslims I met in our investigation after the 1993 World Trade Center bombing were not terrorists. They were Muslims who were seized with a patriotic fervor for the United States, without whom we could not have infiltrated terror cells and stopped a massive murder attack, the plot on the New York City landmarks, which would have killed thousands of people. In my second career as a writer in 2008, I penned an account of my experiences entitled Willful Blindness, a memoir of the jihad. The title is obviously a double entendre. My principal defendant, Omar Abdul Rahman, is a blind and willful exponent of Sharia supremacist ideology. Our government's response to the threat he represents has been and continues to be willfully blind to this ideology, the belief system that catalyzes the threat against us. To grasp this dangerous phenomenon, we need only consider the blind sheikh himself. After the World Trade Center bombing, our government represented to the American people, just as it does today, that the terrorist attack executed by Muslims in express reliance on Islamic scripture was a wanton act, unrepresentative of any mainstream of Islamic thought. But think about the blind sheikh. He was not merely blind, he was beset by several other medical handicaps. Terrorism is hard work, yet here was a man who was the unquestioned leader of a terror cell who seemed utterly incapable of doing anything that would be helpful to a terrorist organization. He couldn't build a bomb, he couldn't hijack a plane, he couldn't carry out an assassination. All he could do was command murder. How could that be? The answer was straightforward, though it was plainly not one that we wanted to hear and still one that we do not want to hear. The blind sheikh is a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence, graduated from Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the seat of Sunni Islamic learning for over a millennium. His area of expertise is Sharia, Islam's legal code and societal framework. The jihadists who listened to him did so because he is an internationally recognized authority in Islamic scripture, specifically of the political ideology drawn from that scripture that inspires attacks against the West. The centrality of ideology tells us why terrorists obeyed the blind sheikh. It tells us why terrorists act, something that we must grasp if we have any hope of defending ourselves and defeating them. Yet, Instead of focusing on this ideology, we have wasted much of the last 2 decades on a fool's errand, attempting to define a true Islam in the futile hope of discrediting terrorists as purveyors of a false Islam. The stubborn fact is there may not be a true Islam. Islam has a rich and diverse history, and there are various interpretations of it, all vying for the mantle of true Islam and denying it to one another. Innumerable factions of Muslims have been debating one another, often violently, for 14 centuries. They have not settled the question, what is the true Islam? The United States is not going to settle it either. From the standpoint of American national security, it is irrelevant whether there is a true Islam. What matters is that there is a Sharia supremacist construction of Islam to which hundreds of millions of Muslims have adhered for centuries. They are supported by centuries of scholarship and scriptural literalism, and we are not going to convince them that they are wrong. Sharia supremacism, their interpretation of Islam, is less a religion as we understand it as it is a political radicalism with a religious veneer. It is virulently anti-Western, misogynist, anti-Semitic, homophobic. It rejects basic tenets of Western liberalism, including the power of people to chart their own destiny and make laws in contravention of Sharia. It rejects individual liberty and equality. It brooks no separation between spiritual life and civil society. It endorses violent jihad to implement and spread Sharia, and it regards the United States, closely trailed by Israel and Europe, as the principal enemies of Islam who must be defeated. This is something we desperately need to understand and highlight, not obscure and avoid. There has been a reluctance to do this, and this is not a partisan issue. Government counterterrorism policy has been willfully blind for a quarter century to the ideological underpinnings of radical Islamic terrorism. The reluctance has been rationalized on the wayward theory that because a person's religious beliefs and political speech are constitutionally shielded from prosecution, they are similarly shielded from mere inquiry and investigation, notwithstanding that we know these are often the precursors to violence. A sensible national security policy cannot regard evidence as if it were hate speech. There is nothing inherently wrong with, much less constitutionally offensive about, the concept that radical religious beliefs or political beliefs should trigger investigations. That is especially the case if those beliefs are conveyed by aggressive language or by association with other radicals or mosques known to endorse jihadism. Here is an important principle we must get right. It cannot be that evidence an investigator may use to prove guilt of terrorism offenses is somehow insulated from an investigator's suspicions about potential terrorism offenses. The goal of counterterrorism is supposed to be the prevention of jihadist attacks, not the hope that there may be a living terrorist or two still around to be indicted and tried only after Americans have been murdered. In 1996, I was awarded the Justice Department's highest honor for proving the nexus between jihadist commands in Islamic scripture, their exploitation by Sharia jurists like the blind sheikh, and the commission of jihadist atrocities by young Muslims that he inflamed. Today, to say aloud what the Clinton administration honored me for 20 years ago is to be ostracized as an Islamophobic bigot. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, that is no way to protect our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy, and I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. I want to begin my questioning with Mr. Haney. And I would note, Mr. Haney, that I think your testimony before this subcommittee today is exceptionally important, and I would commend both members of the media and members of the American public to examine your testimony closely, because you have described a systematic policy, indeed, of scrubbing, sanitizing, erasing references to radical Islam. Indeed, you described in your oral testimony that as the, quote, first great purge. where 876 documents were edited by the FBI to remove references to radical Islamic terrorism. And am I understanding your testimony correctly, that the administration has been systematically scrubbing law enforcement and intelligence materials to remove references to radical Islam?
Yes, it happened a year after the Holy Land Foundation trial, when it was proven in federal court irrefutably that these networks were tied to financial support of Hamas. The 800 and plus records that I was ordered to modify, removing all the linking information out of this system called TEX, were virtually all linked directly to the Muslim Brotherhood network of individuals and organizations established right here in the United States.
And Mr. Haney, I want to draw your attention to the following chart that compares the 9/11 Commission report, which had 126 references to jihad, 145 references to the word Muslim, and 322 references to Islam. Now, if we fast forward to the FBI counterterrorism lexicon, we see the relevant numbers are 0, 0, and 0. Suddenly, jihad, Muslim, and Islam have disappeared. They have likewise disappeared from the National Intelligence Strategy in 2009, 0, 0, and 0. From the Strategic Implementation Plan to Prevent Violent Extremism, 0, 1, 1 slipped in apparently, 0. And finally, the National Intelligence Strategy, 2014. Is this pattern of Orwellian editing of law enforcement and national security materials consistent with your experience and what you observed helping protect this nation?
Yes, the first great purge I referred to was in 2009, but that wasn't the last one. There was another great purge in 2012 when they didn't just modify the records, they completely eliminated them out of the system, which bypasses the security protocol for the Department of Homeland Security. And it may not have mattered except for one tragic consequence. The masjid in San Bernardino and the one in Fort Pierce were directly related to the case of those 67 records that were deleted out of the system.
Mr. Haney, would you elaborate on how potentially focusing on this threat might have helped prevent the San Bernardino terrorist attack or the Orlando terrorist attack?
The networks are made up of individuals and organizations, and individuals don't exist without a network of organizations. You have to look at both of them. That's why there's no such thing as a lone wolf terrorist, because they don't function in a vacuum outside the structure of the community, just like planets don't rotate around the sun without the gravitational force to hold them in place. So to look at these acts as separate from the community is a flaw, because we're looking, first of all, at tactics, not strategy. The strategy is implementation of Sharia law. If we only look on tactics, they are kaleidoscopic and they will change constantly, and we can never acquire a target. If we understand that the underlying strategy of the global Islamic movement, then we understand why these organizations exist in the first place. And then we understand why the people that go there are going to be affected by that gravitational force, if you will, and orbit their lives around that central structure. That's why the mosque in Fort Pierce is called Islamic Center, because it provides a center to their life.
Ms. Kara, your organization asked John Brennan and the Obama administration to, quote, purge references such as this from law enforcement training materials, and at the request of your organization, the administration complied. Is it the position of your administration that the references to jihad and Muslim and Islam in the 9/11 Commission report were somehow offensive or bigoted?
So my organization's position is that training materials as well as intelligence products that were produced by the FBI are not only offensive and inflammatory and alienating Muslims and American Muslims, but more importantly, they make us less safe. And the reason they make us less safe is that I think what the recent tragedies have shown us, including in Orlando, is that we need law enforcement more than ever focusing on finding the needles in the haystack And by broadly painting an entire faith community with a broad brush of suspicion, we're actually dumping more hay onto the haystack and making law enforcement's job more difficult. If I may, if I could just give an example.
With respect, I would like to ask you to just answer the specific question I asked, which is it your organization's position that the 126 references to jihad by the 9/11 Commission were somehow offensive or bigoted?
Let me, I want to make it clear, Mr. Chairman, that our concern is about not just terminology, but it's about what these materials are communicating. So it's not just about using the word jihad or Muslim, but it's what it's communicating to agents and what it's communicating
So am I
to the general
understanding
public.
you don't think it was bigoted to use jihad? I just want to understand your organization's position, whether or not it is bigoted to use the word jihad.
So this is when I think it's problematic. I think it's when we have public officials, whether it's members of Congress, members of the administration, who are going out and describing the problem as a problem of jihad or a problem of radical Islamic terrorism. That's a problem because it's actually playing in to the propaganda frame of ISIS, and it makes us less safe because ISIS wants this to be a war against Islam, and by using religiously loaded terminology like jihad, we're playing into their mindset. And it would be, I might add, it's not only that, but it's also just grossly inaccurate. I think we need to call the threat what it is. It's ISIS, it's Al-Qaeda. And it's no different than the KKK or those who attack abortion clinics. We wouldn't go and say there's a problem with radical Christianity or radical Christian terrorism. We call the threat what it is. It's the KKK. It's those who are attacking women's health clinics.
So, Ms. Kara, I will note that I've asked you now twice if your organization has the view that the 9/11 Commission report was bigoted or offensive, and twice you have declined to answer that pretty straightforward question. So let me try it a different direction.
Oh, maybe I didn't understand your question properly, Mr. Chairman. The use of the term in general by the 9/11 Commission report, I don't think is problematic in itself. I think it's in general as officials are talking about what the threat is. I think that's what the threat. That's what my concern is.
Well, if it wasn't a concern, then why would it be purged from 126 down to 0000?
I can't explain the
At the request of
administration's.
your organization.
I can't. I obviously cannot speak for the administration and these government agencies that did that, and what their thinking was, and developing those documents.
They did
but
so
what
in
I can
response
say,
to a request from your organization in writing calling for a quote purge.
we asked for a purge of bigoted training materials. That's what we called for.
Well, let me try it a different direction. On March 16th, 2015, the Long Island Press quoted Glenn Catan, who is the legal director for your organization, as saying, quote, like, what are you going to do about radicalization in the Muslim community? That's nonsense. There is no such thing. I'm curious, do you agree with the legal director of your organization that there is no such thing as radicalization in the Muslim community?
Well, this is what we do believe, Mr. Chairman. What we believe, and this is based on attacks we've seen in our country in just the last year alone, whether it's the Orlando shooting, the attack on a women's health clinic, the attack at the AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, we know that extremist violence takes many forms and people motivated regardless of their race, religion, or ideology. And what we also know is that there's no pathway, so to speak, to get to that point of engaging in violence. What the national security and law enforcement experts say is that it's the common thread that you see is vulnerable individuals who are seeking a sense of purpose. And so we totally disabuse and do not believe in this canard that there's somehow a pathway to radicalization. And that's what numerous studies have shown as well.
So I want to give you just one more opportunity to answer the question directly, because I don't believe you did. Do you agree with your legal director who said, quote, there is no such thing as radicalization in the Muslim community?
There are violent individuals in all communities, including the Muslim community. But
Is it connected to any ideology?
there are some people who where there is ideology that's a part, but ideology is not the center or even part of the center of the causation for what causes people to engage in violence. And it's not just me that's saying that. It's experts like my colleague, Mr. German, and law enforcement and national security experts who say that.
So I'm just going to give you one more opportunity to say whether yes or no you agree with the legal director, that
There-
there's no such thing as radicalization in the Muslim community. I'll note for the record, Senator Durbin apparently doesn't want you to answer that question.
I would like you to show the courtesy of this witness instead of badgering her.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Durbin.
you've been very courteous.
You know, I'd like an
Mr.
administration
Chairman.
that shows the courtesy to the victims of radical Islamic terrorism and doesn't edit a 9/11 call from a terrorist who's murdering 49 people in Orlando and pretending the threat doesn't exist.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to say that I think you've been very respectful to this witness. The witness has not answered your question, and I think you had a right to pursue it. And you did it in a gentlemanly, professional way, and I'm disappointed that Senator Durbin would not understand that.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, because I do think it is important for us to allow a broader conversation than that one question. Let me go back to the opening testimony, if I might, to Dr. Jasser and to Ms. Kara. Dr. Jasser, you took issue, and many witnesses today took issue with President Obama's alleged refusal to use the very term radical Islam. One of the questions we have is what we're going to do to keep our country safer going forward. The presumptive Democratic nominee, former Secretary Clinton, has used the term radical Islamism. Is this entire hearing dedicated to the difference of those three letters? And in my view, it is worth considering whether proposals made by candidates for president, including the chairman and Donald Trump, to conduct patrols of so-called Muslim neighborhoods, to require a national list of Muslim Americans, to bar Muslims from coming to this country, or to conduct surveillance of First Amendment protected religious activities. I have to ask a question for both of you, if I might, at the outset. Would those proposals make us safer? We've had a lot of testimony here today from this panel about whether or not there is willful blindness, whether or not there is actions taken by dedicated professional law enforcement officials as a result of alleged political correctness by this administration. I think a pressing question for this panel and for the members of this committee, as we look forward to the next administration, is whether we will address this whole problem by simply having a nominee who speaks of radical Islamism, or whether we will address this problem by inflaming the entire Muslim world against us by proposing things that are unsound as a matter of law enforcement practice and unsound as a matter of our own Constitution. Ms. Kara, Dr. Jasser, I'd be interested in your response.
Senator Coons, if I may, I absolutely agree with you that I think just talking about the terminology is not going to just swipe the problem away. And I think the issue is that we need to actually focus on the actual activity of violence, what's causing the violence, and ensuring that law enforcement has the resources they need to actually focus on finding those needles in the haystack, so to speak. And I think, you know, having this dispute about the terminology is not helping law enforcement do its job. We need to focus on the real threat. And I might add that what I said earlier, that the use of this kind of terminology is also potentially counterproductive because it actually feeds in to the narrative and the frame that our enemies want. ISIS wants this to be a war against Islam, a war against Muslims. And to be frank with you, as I was sitting and listening to some of the comments from my colleagues on this panel earlier, I was just really disturbed because I thought, gosh, if ISIS is watching this hearing now, half of these panelists have just given them so much ammunition to go out and create recruiting videos to say, look, this is what the U.S. Senate is doing. They're actually giving a mouthpiece to this kind of, frankly, garbage.
Thank you, Ms. Kara. Dr. Jasser.
Senator Coons, I I wholly reject the moral equivalency that somehow having this conversation is going to unleash hatred and bigotry against Muslims. It actually tells the most democratic country in the world that
If I
we
might,
can't...
didn't Ms. Kara earlier testify to a significant rise in hate crimes against Muslims within the last few years?
The cause and effect relationship, first of all, I would reject. Second of all, I would believe, and I believe, as many Muslim reformers will tell you, that denial actually fuels bigotry. Denial of the problem and the diagnosis creates a treatment that is a short-term whack-a-mole program rather than treating the disease and the cancer at its core, which is theocracy. And it actually polarizes our community in this country into two sides. One that says there is no problem, almost like the alcoholic that doesn't want to deal with it, and the other says that every Muslim is a possible terrorist. And actually, this conversation, and the reason the CVE terminology is adopted by the Saudis and the Turks and the Iranians, is because they love it. They love the fact that they want this U.S. Senate not to talk about political Islam because they can continue to say that they are our allies, all the while the death cult that you say is just a cult is exactly what the Saudi regime does in their country, beheadings and Sharia through Wahhabism and Khomeinism through Iran. They say they're with us on countering violent extremism because they don't want us to unravel, to peel the onion of theocratic Islam, which is the terminology we have to do to treat the real disease. So it's not just terminology. Adding the ISM, Islamism, changing CVE to CVI would allow us to engage Muslim reformers. Ms. Kara and others don't want reformers to have this debate in public. They want us to continue to let our Muslim community be dominated by Islamist apologists from Saudi, Iran, who say, oh, close your eyes. It's not, America can't deal with this because they're a bunch of bigots who really can't separate between theocrats and free-thinking Muslims. So therefore, let the Islamic theocrats of the planet dominate who is Islam.
Thank you, Dr. Jesser.
Senator-
Ms. Kara, if you'd respond, is that the case, that you don't think we can have a robust debate?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And let me just say, I think where my colleague, Mr. Jasser, is going, I think he's trying to have a theological debate, and there may very well need to be a theological debate, whether in the United States or in other Muslim countries. What I'm focused on is how we can keep our country safe. How can law enforcement do its job? And I've been in this work for 15 years. And I've spoken to senior law enforcement officials in the FBI and the Justice Department, in the Bush administration, in the present administration. I never once have heard a senior law enforcement official say that the problem is Islam, that the problem is radical Islam. That's just not an accurate description of the threat, and we frankly make our country less safe if we continue to not focus on the true threat.
And the Saudis
Thank
are happy
you.
with
Mr.
it.
German, if I might turn to you. You served as a FBI officer for 15 years, is that correct?
16.
16. And you conducted numerous investigations, both undercover and direct investigations of radical and extremist groups, both white supremacist and anti-government, but also those who draw some connection to or inspiration from perverted versions of Islam. Would that be roughly accurate?
Roughly.
Okay. And your suggestion in your testimony was that removing from training materials suggestions that are unfounded in fact and that are misleading and that are bigoted actually will make law enforcement more effective, more focused. Talk further about that, if you would.
Sure. A lot of the materials that were uncovered through an ACLU FOIA and later work by investigative journals, Spencer Ackerman and others, showed that this material was not just openly biased against Arabs and Muslims, and actually other groups too. There were Chinese cultural awareness trainings and many others, and they had a lot of factual flaws. And as an investigator trained to do investigations, we want to focus on facts and focus on what it is we're trying to accomplish. And we're trying to accomplish a reduction in violence. When I was working undercover in neo-Nazi groups, there were a lot of people who said a lot of things that I didn't like. And what I had to do, working within the guidelines I had at the time, was objectively evaluate where there was a reasonable indication of criminal activity. And by focusing on the handfuls of people that were actually engaging in criminal activity, I could ignore the vast numbers that were expressing themselves in ways I considered hateful and abhorrent, but weren't illegal. And I believe that our society is robust enough that we can live with those sorts of expressions because they fail by their own lack of merit. And what we need to do is make sure our law enforcement officials and our counterterrorism officials are focused on the facts on the ground rather than theories that don't survive scholarly scrutiny.
So let me make sure I hear you right. Does the removal of factually based, facially biased and factually flawed counterterrorism training materials make us less safe? Does it weaken the ability of law enforcement to identify and intercept potentially violent folks who might engage in acts of terrorism?
No, it makes our law enforcement more effective.
And one of the comments that I made in my opening that the chairman took some difference with was I suggested that Omar Mateen and his actions will be the subject of ongoing scrutiny. What I meant, if I could clarify, was that there are and will continue to be debates in this Senate about whether we should take actions to close the terror watch list loophole that some would argue, I would argue, made it possible for him to acquire powerful weapons. Others might argue, as I do, that we should more adequately fund federal, state, and local law enforcement in order to ensure we've got more boots on the ground, more folks capable of the law enforcement work that you did. Others, and that's, I think, largely the point of this hearing, would suggest that the right response would be to focus on whether there are a few words in a few important guidebooks and whether or not we correctly understand Islamism versus Islam. Do you think closing the terror loophole, or do you think taking stronger actions to support local law enforcement are important to a successful strategy to keep Americans safe?
I'm afraid that the terrorist watch lists have been fraught with problems from the very beginning, and particularly the lack of due process makes it impossible for the public to judge whether these are effective methodologies. Clearly, we've seen cases where people like Tamerlan Tsarnaev were on the watch list, but because the watch list is so bloated, it creates so many false alarms that dulls the response. So in fact, nobody responded to those alarms when the system worked as it was effective. So I would hope that we could see clarity and due process brought to the watch list to make it better. As far as certainly providing more resources to law enforcement is always something that's welcome, but if the model that the FBI is using now, which includes mass surveillance and then trying to whittle down who may or may not present a threat, combined with see something, say something tip lines that flood them with information, what the Webster Commission called the data explosion within the FBI, is actually making it very difficult for them to focus on real threats. And what we need to do is go back to the standards that I worked under, which required an objective, reasonable indication. Very low standard, but you're working with a reasonable indication based on actual evidence of illegal activity rather than flawed theories and mass suspicion that's difficult to clear.
In other words, classic law enforcement work that relies on indication of acts, substantive acts, to further assaults on innocent civilians, rather than loose theories about what Islam is or isn't in the modern world.
Exactly, and if you look at the tens of thousands of investigations that the FBI is doing with these broad authorities, very few of them even find enough information to justify the next level of investigation, which only requires an allegation. And an Inspector General report from 2010 suggested that the FBI agents were actually making their own allegations. So it's not a very high standard to meet that second level, but it was a tiny percentage, I think just over 4%, that even made it to that level. So we're spinning our wheels a lot, creating a lot of false alarms that make it easier for real threats to slip through the cracks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Sessions would be next, but he's kindly allowed Senator Lee to go first due to schedule constraints.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Sessions. And Mr. Jasser, Dr. Jasser, the administration has blamed acts of terrorism at times, acts of terrorism both foreign and domestic, on factors such as poverty and lack of educational opportunities, lack of employment opportunities. Now, when this approach is taken, this approach tends to ignore the profiles of many terrorists in the past, including, for example, many of the 9/11 hijackers, certainly including Osama bin Laden himself. A lot of these people were well educated and had personal wealth and had a lot of career opportunities that were significant, were substantial. In 2015, there was a State Department spokeswoman, Marie Harf, who commented that the lack of opportunities for jobs and good governance were the root causes of ISIS. So I'd like to know from your perspective as a Muslim, one who's worked extensively on studying, on understanding political Islam and the root causes of Islamic extremism. Have you found that these sorts of material factors, including educational opportunities, career opportunities, wealth, et cetera, poverty, have you found that these are the root causes of radicalization within Islamic populations?
Thank you for that, Senator Lee. I'm reminded of a saying that my father and grandfather used to say in Syria, which is, when you point to the moon, the idiot looks at the finger. And, you know, the issue is here is there's a lot of things to blame for, and there are a lot of things that make individuals that are radicalized susceptible. But we also hear this administration blame the Syrian revolution on climate warming. We hear certain things that are narratives that we try in this ethnocentric focus on our own political agenda in America to blame whatever fits into a partisan block checkbox on what's happening in the Muslim world and the Muslim majority countries. And I would tell you that and I'm hearing some of the answers from some of my colleagues on the panel, and I keep hearing this short-term solution versus long-term solutions and a vision. The reason we have the largest agency in government now focused on counter-radicalization is because we have a sophisticated whack-a-mole program. We are not, without a long-term vision, and sometimes just like treating cancer, the patient may get sicker before they get better, but when you don't treat the disease and you just suppress symptoms, you're going to continue to recur and ultimately either kill the patient or not treat and learn about the disease. And I can tell you that the bottom line is that the radical ideology is the fact that Islam is in that time in history that Christianity was in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And we can either sit it out and let the Saudis sit back and the Iranian theocrats and others that are moving movements of hundreds of millions and stay asleep and say that, well, in America, where we are most fitted to have this revolution of ideas within the House of Islam, we can sit back and let them, do it and dominate the conversation under countering violent extremism, or we can weigh in, treat Muslims like adults with tough love and say that they are going to push back and treat the theocratic mentality and have a vision, because otherwise there's a cognitive dissonance that prevents the advancement of the freedom, of the ideas of freedom that can happen in this laboratory in America.
So to take your medical analogy a step further, you referred to treating symptoms instead of addressing the root cause. I assume we could also analogize this to a misdiagnosis. In this instance, if we misdiagnose this as a malady that's brought about as a result of poverty, as a result of lack of educational opportunities or career opportunities, what might we miss?
We'd miss the fact that the prisoners in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, are fighting not for poverty against poverty, they're fighting for freedom, for liberty. And that in this free society, we can't even recognize the voices, the dissident voices. It'd be like in the Cold War, the Natan Sharanskys of the world being told that their voices don't matter, that all that matters is the economic plight under Soviets. In the meantime, our government in the Cold War would cozy up to the Italian communists and other non-Soviet communists as being our allies, when in fact the root problem was communism and socialism and collectivism. So in this battle, the root problem is theocracy, and the government doesn't need to become experts in Sharia, but at least take sides within the House of Islam and let the Arab street, the Pakistani street, stop seeing us as cozying up to the theocrats that are oppressing the movements against the hundreds of millions that are Islamists, and for the majorities of the Green Revolution, the revolution that ousted the Muslim Brotherhood and others. And in America right now, we are letting, by not using the terms, we are letting the Islamists define and lead what it is to be a Muslim, and I reject that as an American Muslim that loves this Constitution.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jasser. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Klobuchar.
I think Senator Durbin might have been next. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Senator Coons. Thank you to our witnesses. This hits at home for me. We have the largest Somali population in the country. I was just went out to meet with our first ambassador in 25 years to Somalia, Ambassador Schwartz, a man who's been in foreign service for over 20 years and is taking on this difficult assignment and understands that this is a balance. And the balance is going after terrorism and evil at its roots at places, in places like Somalia, going after ISIS at its roots, and it's also going after extreme ideologies, Islamic extremism here at home. But in our community, we love our Somali community. Nearly 100,000 people. I have a full-time Somali outreach. He's now been elected to the school board. We have people who are running businesses, who are part of the fabric of life in our state. And I was the prosecutor managing an office of 400 people during 9/11, where Moussaoui was captured. And so we get this balance, and we see it all the time. And I always figured my mission as a prosecutor was to convict the guilty and protect the innocent. And what I have seen, the change from 9/11, when the Bush U.S. Attorney, Tom Heffelfinger, I went around to the mosques and assured people at the President Bush's direction that they would not be victims of hate crimes, that they would not be bullied, that we would stand up for them, and that was part of America. I've seen different rhetoric right now that is hurting those communities and not furthering justice. I met with some of our people from our Muslim community a few months ago at a mosque and heard the story of a family that had gone out for dinner. Their family where their parents had experienced no discrimination before. They were simply having dinner with their 2 kids, and a man walked by and said, "You 4 go home. You go home to where you came from." And the little girl looked at her mom and said, "Mom, I don't want to go home. You said we could go out to dinner tonight. I want to eat dinner here. I don't want to eat dinner at home." Those were the innocent words of a child, because she only knows one home, and that is Minnesota. And she only knows one home, and that is the United States of America. So in a state where we've now had dozens of indictments against people who have been trying to go to join those evil terrorist organizations of Al-Shabaab and ISIS, where we have convicted people in just the past month, understanding how important this is, respecting our law enforcement, our FBI, our U.S. Attorney appointed by this administration for their work, I still understand how we cannot indict an entire religion and an entire community because of the conduct of a few. So this is a balance. I guess my first question, and I've heard that Congressman Ellison's name was raised. He is my congressman. He is a man of great patriotism. He is a man that is paired up with Tom Emmer, one of the most conservative members over in the House, who took Michelle Bachmann's seat to start the Somali caucus. The 2 of them have done that together because we don't see politics as getting in the way of not just the prosecution of criminals and evil, but also in the defense of Americans and innocent Americans. And I heard his name was raised, but I know that I want everyone on the panel to know that he has been an advocate for funding, as I have been, as a Senator Franken, as have been many, to figure out how we can go after this and figure out when kids and young people, no parent want their kids to grow up to be a terrorist, are influenced by this, and how we can do a better job of identifying problems. And that's why the Homeland Security, I know Jay Johnson's going to be testifying here, we're going to ask him about this, that we're putting out some grants now from Homeland Security. We put something like $50 million in the last appropriations bill to try to go after this violent extremism. And I guess I'd ask you, Mr. German, first about how you think this could work and how this is part of the solution, in addition to what I support is strong law enforcement, but this side of it too, to try to prevent these kids from being influenced in the first place. Thank you for the question. And I've been fortunate enough to go to Minneapolis and speak quite a bit with the Minneapolis Somali American community. I think part of the problem is keeping the frame as extremism. I mean, when you look at the foreign travel, in the first instance during the Somali Civil War, there was an invasion from a foreign country into their ancestral homeland. So
since there has been a United States of America, Americans have gone to fight in foreign conflicts, not just ones that they have some familial attachment to, but where they felt some interest in either becoming part of a big adventure or some ideological attachment to one side or another, and we have treated that as a normal part of American life. We now have this prism of extremism where we ignore the conflicts going on and treat it as a problem within the heads of these children. And my concern is that by doing so, what we're doing is shoving the conversations about those foreign conflicts into the dark corners of the room, right? So parents tell their children, don't talk about politics in Somalia or Syria and Iraq when you're in the classroom. Don't talk about that when you're in the mosque.
I don't think that's what this program's about, Mr. German. I mean, this is not about that. It's about working with communities and trying to give them the kind of support they need. So if a kid is starting to have issues and they see things, that they start pairing them up with people so they can figure out what's happening.
So I've been looking at these programs, and part of the
But you
problem...
don't support them.
It's difficult to say that because I can't get information about them.
Okay.
We have been trying very hard. These are public-facing programs. We should be able to evaluate them publicly.
Okay,
but
so
many of the
key-
programs...
So we should be asking Jay Johnson about this when he comes before their hearing. I want to see if some of the other views here, because some of these people that have been recruited in Minnesota there is some terrorist cell issues, other people recruiting them, but a lot of times it's people on the internet. And obviously we have First Amendment rights, there's all kinds of things. Just any ideas, maybe you, Mr. Cohen, and then I will move on because I have 2 minutes over already here, about what we should be doing here to limit some of this recruiting and taking responsibility with the private and public sector, because this is slick recruiting that's going on right now, right within our midst.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We have to put out alternative voices and, not have a narrative that we are opposed to them or that we are attacking their religion. There was this big study done by the people at Duke, and they surveyed almost 400 law enforcement officials and talked to over 200 community members in a variety of focus groups. And the sense was that there was sort of an oppressive atmosphere from law enforcement toward these communities. And that, I think, is pernicious and counterproductive. So I think we have to maybe restart and rethink some of these programs and, of course, provide alternative narratives for the young people. If I could add one more thing, if I could. A lot of the rhetoric in the presidential campaign has been, I think, pernicious for young people. We did a nationwide survey of teachers to ask, what has happened in your classroom as a result of this? And there are a lot of kids who are feeling bullied, a lot of kids who are feeling scared, especially young people.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard the same thing.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous thing too. And so I think it's really quite important that all of us, especially people in your position, positions of other persons on this committee, speak out against that.
Right, and that's something that President Bush actually focused on after 9/11.
It made a big difference.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Sessions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Cohen, I remember during the Civil Rights days, and your organization was standing firm for equality, and Morris Dees sued the Klan and forfeited their entire headquarters and went after them aggressively and condemned their radical ideas. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, Mr. Jasser. Aren't you saying that it's all right if someone advocates a position that's extreme or violent or incompatible with the Republican doctrines of America, the constitutional order, that they should be challenged on those beliefs? Isn't that the honest way we debate issues in this country?
I believe there is nothing that would melt away Muslim bigotry more than for America to see Muslims step to the plate and counter theocracy. Once they see that we are the most essential head of the spear in this battle, and they see our Muslim reform movement that has a declaration of 15 principles that we signed where we condemn all concepts of the Islamic State, we condemn violent jihad, we condemn the Sharia state, we condemn the caliphate. We sent this to every mosque and Muslim organization in America and have gotten crickets back. Why? Because the media, academia, and government are complicitly giving Muslims a pass in weighing in about whether they side with American constitutionalism. And I hear references to President Bush's administration and what he said. Post-2011, it's completely different. The Arab awakening has unleashed the need to counter the regimes that have fixed the narrative in the West. So to compare what we did pre-2011 to what we're doing post-Arab awakening, I think is just folly and ignorance.
Mr. Jasser, I remember during the civil rights days, national TV networks, maybe they were atheists, maybe they were Jewish or Catholic or whatever, going into churches in the South, sticking a camera in the face of a preacher and asking them, can an African American, can a black person worship in your church, yes or no? This was a difficult question, and it was pretty tough. But I thought, in retrospect, that kind of challenge caused people to realize the position was untenable, and it could not be defended in public debate, and it went away, essentially. Is that the kind of challenge you think that ought to be made to extremist groups that within the Islamic rubric?
Absolutely. We need to challenge Muslims to realize that violent homophobia comes from nonviolent homophobia. Violent misogyny evolves from nonviolent misogyny. So when the president goes to a mosque, he went to the Islamic Society of Baltimore. Here's a mosque that had gender apartheid as a policy within its mosque. It had a sermon which was a screed against homosexuals a year prior that our Muslim reform movement publicized and said, look at, why is he going to this mosque? And it appeared to be a bigotry of low expectations that somehow we don't hold Muslims accountable to the same values we do everybody else in the West and in this country. But no, on the National Prayer Breakfast, we'll get lectures to Christians, to Jews, and others. But when it comes to Muslims, the mosque he chooses as a backdrop is in the 13th century when it comes to women's rights, gay rights, and other rights. So the issue is, treat us with tough love, hold us accountable, and the bigotry that exists in America will melt away because they'll see us as essential in this battle.
Well, the Islamic world and the Muslim religion is a great religion. Millions of people follow its doctrines and don't believe in these things. Villages and cities throughout the world, this occurs, and I don't see there's anything wrong with challenging that doctrine that some adhere to. Mr. McCarthy, they say, well, this is not Islam, but the people who practice this ideological, violent, terroristic idea believe they're practicing Islam, do they not?
They certainly do, and they have a lot of basis for doing so.
With regard to Ms. Kira, I think there's some theological issues here. If you believe your religion calls for certain things, you may not believe that, but some do. And this causes part of the problem, does it not, Mr. McCarthy?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem you have is the imputation of bigotry and bias to fact. I mean, when I was a prosecutor doing these cases, it was simply a fact that there are commands to violence in the scripture, that they are mediated and exploited by people like the blind sheikh, and they inspire young Muslims to commit violence. Now, the way he interpreted those verses is certainly not the only way to interpret them. And a lot of the heroic work I think that Dr. Jasser does is precisely to try to either correct what may be translation errors or to contextualize these very bellicose, disturbing verses. But are we really going to put our head in the sand about whether they're there?
That's what we're dealing with, colleagues. I wish it were not so, that there are people that can find verses within the Quran or the Hadith that justify violence and we can say it's not religious if we want to, but they think it is. Mr. Haney, did you? I understood you to say that Sharia law, is it a part of the Quran itself? Is a call to Sharia law a part of the Quran? I didn't know that it was.
It's called the Deen.
Speak up. The button.
It's called the Deen. There are several names for it in Arabic. Deen means law and or belief or religion. Sharia is derived from a combination of the Quran itself, the Hadith, the sayings and actions of Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, and also what you might call tradition, all combined together into one what's called ijtima, one consensus. So it's partially Quranic, partially Hadith. It is the gravitational force that brings order to the universe of Islam, and it's a very important concept. Sharia is the driving force of the global Islamic community and simultaneously of the global Islamic movement. What we see are expressions, are tactics, ways to implement, or I should say ways to achieve the goal of implementing Sharia law, tactical ways, all the way in a spectrum from what is called dawah, promotion or invitation to join Islam, up to what we call jihad, and other operative verbs like kharaj and qatl, which means slaughter or push away. Those verbs are more frequent in the Quran than jihad. So if we are going to have an honest discussion about the strategy and tactics of the global Islamic movement, like several have said here, then what we really need to do is address honestly and with courage the actual verbs and meanings of the words that we have been constantly told to ignore or purge away, and what they actually mean and how they drive the individuals that we've seen, like Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik and Nidal Hassan and Omar Mateen and other people like that, the Sarnea brothers.
Well, Mr. McCarthy, you very accomplished prosecutor. I recall the Manson trial. They proved the ideology, the motivating factors to the Manson group and why they did the murders. That's what you did in your case, did you not? You identified and proved as part of your case the motive based on what they interpreted their faith to mean.
Yeah, and I respectfully find it mind-boggling to have a conversation in which it's suggested that we need to turn a blind eye to ideology when you actually get into the four corners of a trial on most of the charges that we bring, which are essentially conspiracy cases in almost every single instance. The very evidence that they say we shouldn't look at for purposes of the investigation is the evidence that the prosecutor has to admit at the trial in order to prove willfulness, in order to prove intent, and in order to prove knowledge. So we're actually saying that in investigating people who might potentially commit a terrorist attack, we have to close our eyes to their ideology. But if we're lucky enough to indict them at some point, and we get them to trial, then we can put into evidence all the things we didn't look at when we were investigating.
Well, you're a lawyer.
How crazy is that?
Well, just briefly, this nation cannot admit everybody that would like to come here to immigrate to America, and there are two Muslim applicants. Is it appropriate to ask whether one has an extremist ideology and ask questions about how they interpret it or not? Is it some constitutional protection that the United States cannot inquire to see who might be the most successful immigrant?
I don't think there's any constitutional impediment to it. That said, during the 1960s into, I guess it's the early 80s, there was a lot of statutory work that was done supportive of the proposition that we needn't be worried about ideology, that it's not a causative trigger of violent action, and therefore we're only going to look at violent action, not ideology, when we decide whether to bring people in or not. Now, it was not constitutionally necessary to do that, and I think a lot of it was caused by the fact that The Supreme Court in the 60s and 70s gave expanded First Amendment protection to radical ideology, which was a terrible mistake, but I think made out of a calculus that the Soviet threat had been overwrought. But whatever you think about that, we're now in a threat environment where it's not a hypothetical question about whether there's an ideology that triggers mass murder attacks. We're seeing it.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I appreciate the hearing. And we are seeing, I think, a spasm, I've called it, within Islam, that experts have testified before Armed Services Committee that's real. There's some radical ideas that are leading to these kind of attacks, and it's going to take a long time for us to see that wane, and maybe it's incumbent on us all to be firm and defend our country, but at the same time, think deeply about the right way to handle it, because religion is something we all in this country respect, the freedom of religion.
Thank you, Senator Sessions.
Mr. Chairman, could I just respond to something that was said earlier during this panel questioning?
Well,
Yeah.
we're going to recognize Senator Durbin, and he may
Okay.
well give you the opportunity
Okay,
to do
thank
that.
you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I listened to Senator Sessions' questions, and I really think he really is moving us to where we ought to be. Mr. Cohen, when you went after or your organization went after the Ku Klux Klan, you were aware that their symbol was a flaming cross,
Yes, sir.
and that they believed that somehow they were espousing the teachings of Christ.
Right, they were purifying the race, yes.
And these race purifications ended up in hateful and violent and murderous tactics against African Americans,
That was the way they did business, yes.
Catholics, Jews. They were a hate-filled group that used a flaming cross and their purified Christianity for justification.
Yes.
Westboro Baptist Church sends demonstrators to the funerals of our fallen soldiers. I've seen them in Illinois. And they put up these hateful signs that say, this soldier died because of sodomy, because of gay marriage. Their homophobia, they believe, is part of their Christian belief. I think the point that has been made over and over by three members of this panel is it is a mistake for us to then call the Ku Klux Klan radical Christians, or to call Westboro Baptist radical Christians. They are extreme, they're violent, they're radical, they're unacceptable. But it reflects on all of us who count ourselves as Christians if you use a term that is so broad in its application. No one is arguing, Mr. McCarthy, that someone who possesses a dangerous ideology, dangerous to the United States, should ever be allowed to immigrate. But presumptive Republican nominee Donald Trump isn't making that distinction, my friends. He wants to exclude all Muslim immigrants. That, to me, is where he has gone way beyond the needs of protecting America into territory which I hope this country will never, ever embrace. It's interesting to me that last week we had a debate on the floor of the Senate on terrorism, and the debate got down to the question as to whether or not we should be wary or careful when a suspected terrorist wants to buy an assault weapon, a firearm. And many of us said, let's err on the side of safety. And unfortunately, only 8 Republicans would join Senator Collins, another Republican, when she suggested that maybe we keep the guns out of their hands until we find out whether they truly should be on the no-fly list. We couldn't carry the day. So the presumption when it came to the Second Amendment was give them the gun, ask questions later. Now we have this hearing. And instead of dealing with suspected terrorists, we're dealing with a suspected religion, according to some. That's where I think we've crossed the line. If there are those who would abuse their religious beliefs, threaten others, and threaten America, for goodness sakes, use all of our power to protect us. But the notion that we would call for radical Christians, radical Islam, and such, and therefore have the right answer to keeping America safe, I think is just fundamentally wrong. And I'll say this, I had plenty of disagreements with President George W. Bush on a spectrum of issues, but I still marvel at the fact that after all we went through on 9/11, he would say to America, quote, all Americans must recognize that the face of terror is not the true face of Islam. Islam is a faith that brings comfort to 1 billion people around the world, It's a faith that has made brothers and sisters of every race. It's a faith based upon love, not hate. Thank you, President George W. Bush, for reminding us at that terrible moment in history who the real enemies were. They weren't people of the Islamic faith. They were those who had violent, extreme views and were ready to kill, to execute that, like the Ku Klux Klan, like the hate mongers of the Westboro Baptist Church. That president at that moment in history got it right. And we've got to get it right today, because we're being called on, like many generations have in the past, to respond to a legitimate fear of terrorism in a way consistent with our American values. And when we lapse into this notion that we are going to condemn a faith, I think we've gone way too far. Ms. Kara, I know you wanted to say something earlier, but let me ask you first. Do you live in a Muslim neighborhood?
No, I do not.
You know what a Muslim neighborhood is?
I was scratching my head a bit when I first heard that term used. The Muslim community in the United States, with few exceptions, is actually quite spread out and integrated into the broader America.
That's my experience too. I mean, I can show you some Irish Catholic parishes in Chicago and some areas on the North Shore where Jewish populations live, but the Muslim population is not that large per se, and they seem to be dispersed. And when we talk about patrolling and enforcing Muslim neighborhoods, as one member of this panel has, I'm at a loss. What was he trying to say? What is a Muslim neighborhood?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Senator, if I could just add to your statement of acknowledging President Bush and what he did, and the importance really of bipartisanship. I think this issue of really pushing back against these frankly un-American and unconstitutional proposals to marginalize and target a group of Americans based on their faith it's not consistent with the Constitution. It's not consistent with our values. And I might add that it's not just yourself and some members on your side of the dais, but I also want to specifically acknowledge Senator Flake and Senator Graham, who've been very courageous with their words as well in urging to tamp down this kind of divisive rhetoric.
Let me just add, and thanks Senator Graham who's here, but let me just add, I called Senator Flake at his home on a Saturday evening when he visited a mosque in Arizona and thanked him.
I sent personal thank you letters to Senator Flake and Senator Graham.
It was such a thoughtful gesture, totally consistent with what President George W. Bush reminded us.
That was the mosque I attend, Senator.
Yes. Well, I thank Senator Flake for having the courage to do it.
Thank
I
you.
yield the floor.
And Senator Durbin, can I just add one more thing that I wanted to say earlier, and that was, I just want to make it clear that there have been hundreds of imams and Islamic religious scholars in the United States and around the world that have condemned terrorism, routinely condemned terrorism, and in fact, there are a number of U.S. Muslim religious scholars who have actually taken on the narrative of ISIS, in fact, at great peril to themselves. A number of them have received specific death threats from ISIS because of that work that they're doing, and so I cringe when I hear people saying that Muslims are not speaking out against the contortion of their faith for violent ends.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Durbin. Senator Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is an important hearing, and I'm glad we're having it. So I need to probably go to my own church, then go to a mosque. I haven't been to my own church in a while. Is there a fight for the heart and soul of Islam afoot between a few radicals and most Muslims? Is that a fair statement? Either one of you?
Sure, Senator Graham.
Of the Muslim faith?
That's my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, is about the fact that this is, terrorism is simply a symptom, and the underbelly of it. And I cringe at the moral
So the
equivalence.
answer is yes?
Yes, sir.
All right. So what about you, ma'am?
I think there is definitely robust discussion within Muslim communities in the U.S. and around the world.
It's important for America to side with those that would live in peace with us and would build a better world in the faith, which is overwhelming supermajority.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's not only peace, it's those that share our values of liberty and individual rights.
So here's what I've learned after 37 trips to Iraq and Afghanistan. Most people over there are not buying what ISIL's selling, the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. All things being equal, most moms and dads don't want to turn their daughters over to these nut jobs. So when I hear they're all the same, you need to go over there more, because they're not. The bottom line is that most people will be culturally different, but sort of buy into the idea that radical Islam is not for them. So we need partners in the faith. Now, back here at home, how many of you think we're fighting a war and not a crime? How many of you think we're at war, a state of undeclared war with radical Islam? Do you feel comfortable with that?
I think we're doing both. There's obviously a war.
Yeah, I
happening
agree,
overseas,
but I
and
mean, they've
there's also
declared war
criminal
on
activity.
us.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between fighting a war and a crime, and this is really important. What do we do when we find, are there radical imams out there in the country that sympathize with ISIL and Al-Qaeda inside the country, inside the United States?
I've never heard of one inside the United States.
I believe there are imams that may condemn violence, the tactic, but I think they sympathize with the division of the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, which is, in Arabic, the land of Islam and the land of war. So there are those who believe that war can be fought not by necessarily guns and ammunition, but by civilizational jihad, where they believe they can advance their ideas through a evangelism of their theopolitical mentality.
The only reason I mentioned this is I don't want to profile the Muslim, let me tell you my experience with the American Muslim. Young man who grew up in Afghanistan, went to high school in Afghanistan, graduated from high school, came to, I think, Chicago. I can't remember his American hometown. Joined the Army, went back to Afghanistan as an interpreter, took me over to his former high school where they were having election polling, wearing a uniform. His job was to guard me and the general that went with me. There were about 8 or 10 of us. He embraced his principle. He started crying. All of us started crying. So that's my view of American Muslims. They're out there in the fight. But if you do have a radical mosque or a radical preacher or a radical whatever, is it okay to follow them and monitor what they do?
So I think there's a difference between somebody who has radical thoughts or is espousing radical thoughts and then actual violence. I think, as you can certainly appreciate, Senator Graham, having radical thoughts is not illegal. Some would actually say it's downright American.
No, I agree, but it's not downright American to be sympathetic. See, when I first went in the Air Force, I had to sign a form that I wasn't a member of the Communist Party. Well, that was in 1977. I'm sure if I said I was, I would not have gotten into the Air Force. So the enemy was the communist ideology. So all I'm suggesting is that this young man, who happens to be an American Muslim, hates the ideology as much as I do, if not more, because he'd be the first victim, not me. They'd kill him before they'd kill me, because he's, in their eyes, worse of a problem. What I'm trying to suggest here is that the guy who did the killing in Orlando went to the same mosque as the guy who was the suicide bomber in Syria. What are the odds of that happening without something going on in that mosque? And they not really know each other.
I'd like to address that.
Sure.
As a subject matter expert and a law enforcement officer who took a vow to protect the American people from threat, both foreign and domestic, this icon of this organization, which is a major global level organization operating in the United States, says very plainly in its logo what its intention is. In English, it says Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America.
Well, you're not answering my question.
What I'm trying to say is that there is a current within the Islamic community in the United States to conform to Sharia law. What we're actually talking about aren't the tactics of radicalism or jihad.
I got you. You're not answering my question. Who's the FBI guy?
I was a former FBI.
Okay. What are the odds of these two guys going to the same mosque and not know each other?
I have no idea what those odds are, but that was something the FBI investigated, so I'm sure that's something you can find out.
All I'm suggesting is I'm all in to partnering with the faith, because you can't win the war without it. American Muslims if there's a hero in this war, it's an American Muslim who will take up arms against radical Islam. If I had to create a hero for the times in which we live, it's somebody of the Muslim faith who's an American citizen, wear the American uniform and take the fight over there to these bastards. So that's my perspective. But when you have centers of radical activity, I don't want us to get so politically correct, and that's the whole purpose of this hearing, is that we ignore the obvious. How in the hell could it be that the guy that killed 49 people in a club in Orlando, who went to the same mosque as the guy who became a suicide bomber in Syria, that there's not something going on there, and how did the FBI miss it?
It's entirely reasonable to figure that, and if we feel like we're so hamstrung we can't investigate
That's
that,
the
then we
point of
can't.
this hearing. Have we gone too far the other way that you can't talk about the obvious?
Let me suggest this. In my case, we proved that the mosque was the hub of the conspiracy, that it was used for the storage of weapons, that it was used for recruiting, for conspiratorial conversations, for plotting, and they used it because they thought that was a safe place to do that. And if we signal, and it's not just a signal, it's a fact, that we are closing not just our law enforcement, but our intelligence gathering and investigative eyes in what's supposed to be a war, where we actually have an authorization of military force and people in harm's way, then we're not fighting a war that we have any interest in winning.
Now, having said that, I believe that the overwhelming majority of mosques in this country are not that way. But when you find a connection, how do we deal with it, ma'am? Doctor, could you, I want your perspective as much as anybody else. I'm trying to solve a problem. I'm trying to prevent an attack.
Senator, the problem comes to how you define radical. Right now, when we say violent extremism is the problem, we define radical as those who would want to take up arms against America. And you have people lining up, signing fatwas and religious rulings that they are nonviolent, they condemn the terror. But when you define radical as those who are anti-Semitic, who are homophobic, who perpetrate conspiracy theories about American military and American policies, all of these are the underbelly of ideas.
Well, Mr. Cohen would agree with you, right?
And our community needs a 12-step program. The reason he can be at the same mosque is there is such a complete denial between the connection of nonviolent Islamism to violent Islamism that they're going to be at the same mosque and not realize it because they're not going to connect. Just like the alcoholic that needs that first step, they're in denial. And we perpetrate that denial by ignoring the verbiology.
Ma'am, what would you say?
I think law enforcement, if there's reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, law enforcement needs to go there and they need to conduct a full investigation.
That's a good way to end this. And that's all we're talking about, is fighting a war, not a crime. Good surveillance techniques that are within the constitutional values. And I am convinced that the purpose of this hearing, Senator Cruz, that you've worried that we've gone too far the other way. And that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Graham. Mr. McCarthy, in your testimony, you talked about peaceful Muslims here in America who worked with you and were integral to helping prosecute the Blind Sheik case. Can you describe to this committee the difference between the Muslim faith and Islamism that embraces violent jihad?
I think it's hard to define the Muslim faith because there are too many divergent interpretations of it. It's easy to identify what we call Islamism, or I prefer to call Sharia supremacism, which is really a radical political ideology with a religious veneer, not a religion as we understand it in the West. My impression listening to the back and forth today is that we are underestimating how serious a problem it is. I don't think it's a handful of radicals versus everyone else who was just embracing the West. I brought along a well-known classic Sharia manual today that I'll supply with the committee's permission, called Reliance of the Traveler, which is an ancient authoritative manual of Sharia law. I opened to the page that says jihad. Jihad means to war against non-Muslims, and it explains where the etymology of it is drawn from. We could go through several different aspects of it, whether it's penalties for apostasy, inequality against women, inequality against non-Muslims, and so forth. I think, Mr. Chairman, the reason that it's relevant is this is not crazy Islamophobic Andy McCarthy's view of what Islamism is. This is a manual that in the front of it, they thought it was important enough to include the endorsement of the Al-Azhar Research Academy, basically the Sharia faculty at the seat of Sunni Islamic learning since the 10th century. It's also endorsed by the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is a Muslim Brotherhood think tank that's been operating in the United States, I believe, since the early 1980s. There are other endorsements as well. But the point is that this political ideology, which is radical in the United States because it would supplant our Constitution since its core tenets are antithetical to our Constitution. So to me, that's radical, whether you want to blow up a bridge to get it done or not. If you want to supplant the United States Constitution with a totalitarian legal code and societal framework, that's pretty radical. There's an awful lot of people who buy onto this to one degree or another. Some percentage of them will become jihadists. Some larger percentage of them will create enclaves or safe spaces, I guess that's the popular common term, right? Safe spaces for this ideology to take root and to grow. And the forcible commands in it and the bellicose interpretation of it is something that is preached and endorsed by very influential scholars in this belief system. So it's a shame that it has enough religious tenets to it, the oneness of Allah, the duty to pray, and so on, that we allow it to cloak itself in the guise of religion rather than what it actually is, which is a totalitarian political philosophy and ideology. But I think we make a big mistake when we underestimate the hold that it has on a group as big as 1.6 billion people.
And Dr. Jasser, if I understood you correctly, it was your testimony that we do a disservice to the American Muslim community when we lump in peaceful Muslims who share our values with the Islamists who, as you've written about, are waging a war for the soul of Islam. Is that a fair understanding?
Yes, sir. I think that it's too easy to, if people ask where are the voices of moderate Islam, there's been no urgency. It's time that Muslims wake up, that there's an urgency for us to speak out, not just against the tactic, but against the root cause. And our Muslim reform movement is trying to do that. It's a bipartisan effort to try to lay out what are the ideas that make us Muslims that believe in the faith of Islam, that separate us from this global, massive political movement, Islamism. Large parties, and at the core is this identification with the Islamic State. The reason ISIS is recruiting to the levels it is Muslims growing up in this country and in the West end up wanting to die for that identification in the Islamic State. The only counter to that is not this whack-a-mole of countering extremism, but starting to teach our kids that it would be much preferable to want to die for America. Until we start teaching Muslims that difference and engaging programs that do that, we're going to continue this whack-a-mole program.
Well, Dr. Jasser, I thank you for your courage in defending truth at risk and at knowing risk of great personal vilification and even personal risk. That is a powerful and important demonstration of courage.
Thank you.
You know, when Senator Graham was asking his questions, I found one exchange with Ms. Kira really quite remarkable in that Senator Graham asked if there were any radical imams in the United States who had sympathies with ISIS and al-Qaeda, and Ms. Kira's testimony was she had never heard of any radical imams in the United States who had sympathies with al-Qaeda or ISIS. I found that truly an astonishing statement, although I would note it was a statement entirely consistent with the purge that Mr. Haney testified about, the Obama administration has undertaken, because indeed, one of the things the purge did is, and I quote, removed references to mosques specifically as a radicalization incubator. So she was testifying consistent with this purge. I wanted to ask some of the other witnesses on this panel if you share Ms. Caro's view of having never heard of a radical imam in the United States who embraces or who sympathizes, that was Senator Graham's exact question, with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. I know, Mr. Gubbets, you went undercover at CARE. Did you encounter?
Well, first of all,
Please turn your microphone on.
well, we can't forget, and I'll go into some current imams, but Anwar al-Awlaki was an imam. The blind sheikh was one of the most knowledgeable people of Sharia, one of the most knowledgeable scholars on Islam. My time at CARE, Siraj Wahaj consistently talks about the implementation of Sharia law, which is no different than the ideology of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Anyone that reads their magazines, anyone that studies their ideology, they are constantly quoting Islamic law from the hadiths of Bukhari and Muslim, from the Quran. They are constantly quoting that. No different than any of the imams like Imam Siraj Wahaj. I think we have a fundamentally flawed approach to this war. We have to look at Sharia, and it is as Mr. McCarthy said, this is a much bigger problem than what we're willing to accept.
So Mr. Gubbets, when Omar Satine was talking to 911 at 2:35 a.m., that call was recorded, and we now have the transcript. I'll read a portion of it. The operator asked, "What is your name?" "My name is, I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State." "Okay, what is your name?" "I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, may God protect him," Arabic, "on behalf of the Islamic State." That's what the tape recording showed.
Mm-hmm.
However, when the Attorney General released it, the words that were omitted were Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State, and then 2 sentences later, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and then the second half of that state, the Islamic State. What does it say to you that the Department of Justice is sanitizing and erasing the statement of who the Orlando terrorist was pledging his allegiance to?
It means if we don't change course, we can expect more tragedies like what happened in Orlando.
And that would be consistent also with the purge explicitly removing, quote, references to mosques specifically as a radicalization incubator. Would you put that in the same category?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. McCarthy, I want to talk about, you talked about the threat of Islamism, and I want to talk about some of the symbols, some of the evidence we had in terror attack after terror attack, because some of my Democratic colleagues have suggested this is simply about the use of a word or two, or even, as my friend Senator Cruz says, about 3 letters, ism. And I would suggest that the only reasonable conclusion from this hearing is that this deliberate and willful blindness is costing American lives over and over again. Whether you look at Little Rock or Fort Worth or Chattanooga or San Bernardino, over and over again we see warning signs. Over and over again the Obama administration has evidence of radical Islamic terrorism, and over again it doesn't act to prevent it. I would mention Nidal Hassan. The Obama administration knew that he had been in electronic communication with the radical Islamic cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, who Mr. Gubbets just made reference to. The Obama administration knew that he had asked about the possible justifications for waging jihad against his fellow soldiers. And yet, the administration did nothing. And Nidal Hassan murdered 14 innocent souls. In your view, is a soldier communicating with a radical Islamic cleric, Anwar al-Awlaki, asking about the permissibility of waging jihad against his fellow soldiers, preparing PowerPoint presentations, laying out what he believed was a Quranic command to wage jihad? In your view, are those significant red flags that it should have moved the administration to action?
They're highly significant red flags, and to dismiss them because it was consistent with his research, as I understand was the main reason, is reckless.
And indeed, what his fellow officers said, part of the reason that they did not act against him was political correctness. Let's look at another example, the Zarnaf brothers in Boston. The administration knew that Russia had pointed out that the Tsarnaev brothers had traveled to predominantly Muslim Chechnya and Dagestan provinces. He was interviewed by the FBI, the elder brother. Russian authorities a second time notified the administration that they believed them to be religious extremists. The elder brother returned to Chechnya and met with Chechen terror-related groups. He posted on YouTube a public call to jihad. And yet the administration had stopped watching him at that time, did not see the public call to jihad. And that ended up culminating in the two brothers setting off pressure cooker bombs at the Boston Marathon that murdered 3 people and injured approximately 180 others. Are those, once again, significant red flags that ought to be met with a serious law enforcement and national security response to prevent acts of terrorism?
I believe they are, and I think they underscore the problem with treating ideology as if it were not a trigger to violence.
And the final example I'll focus on is Omar Mateen. Now, Omar Mateen was interviewed by the FBI not once, not twice, but 3 times. Omar Mateen had told his co-workers that he was involved with both Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. Omar Mateen had watched videos of the radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki. That is one connecting theme of a number of these terrorists. Omar Mateen was interviewed one time because of his relationship with Moner Mohammed Abu Salha, the first American-born suicide bomber who died in Syria in 2004. And there's evidence to indicate they may have attended the same mosque. Are those, again, the sorts of red flags that ought to trigger serious law enforcement and national security scrutiny to prevent terrorist attacks?
Yes, they are.
Is it a reasonable inference in your experience, having spent nearly 2 decades as a prosecutor, that the administration's scrubbing, refusal to acknowledge the existence of jihad or radical Islam, as this chart shows, literally erasing it from their training materials, has some connection to this administration over and over and over again having serious evidence of radical Islamic terrorism and yet not acting to prevent terrorist attacks on United States soil?
I think so. And again, I think it's incredibly reckless to take the position that because ideology is constitutionally protected to have, such that you can't prosecute someone for having it, that you therefore drop investigative efforts and drop intelligence efforts on the theory that ideology is simply something we don't need to worry about.
Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. Senator Cruz.
I'm going to defer to Senator Blumenthal for the second round.
Senator
Thank you.
Blumenthal, I didn't see you return.
Well, I noticed you were very absorbed in your questions, as you should be, and thank you for having the hearing. I'm interested, in light of the statements of allegiance that were made by the San Bernardino and the Orlando killers, and the credit taken by ISIS for at least the Orlando massacre. What objective evidence there is that ISIS is inspiring or supporting terrorist extremists here? And I think there is evidence of it, if only the evidence that has been made public. I understand there is other evidence as well. It troubles me greatly. And I think the nation has to be more vigilant and vigorous in countering the efforts of ISIS to inspire and support extremist violence here. And extremist violence can take a lot of forms, but killing 49 people with an assault weapon qualifies for me as violence. And when it's done with a claim of allegiance to ISIS, then I think it raises some red flags. So let me ask you, Mr. McCarthy and others, what objective evidence you see of ISIS inspiring or supporting
Senator,
this kind of violence?
I think that that ISIS, like Al Qaeda, like other terrorist organizations, is less important than the ideology which transcends them all and will outlast them all, and is what is actually the catalyzing feature here. Now, specifically with respect to ISIS, we know that the organization has made it quite clear that it would like to see jihadists in place in the United States and elsewhere in the West commit acts of terrorism that they can, attribute to ISIS and then take advantage of. But I would suggest to you that it's the ideology more than the organization that is doing the inspiring.
Yeah.
Also, I would go a step further and just to point out how serious of a problem this is, the threat doctrine with Sharia. We could kill every member of ISIS tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect the global Islamic movement. It wouldn't affect the global jihad. It would slow it down until they caught up. We could kill every member of Al Qaeda tomorrow. If we don't address strategies and implement policies to address Sharia and the spread of Sharia doctrine, like Dr. Jasser said, we'll be playing whack-a-mole with jihadi groups. It won't end.
Mr. Germain.
I think we need to be careful. Clearly, where there's a conspiracy, law enforcement should track down everybody who is involved in the conspiracy. But what we have to understand about terrorist methodology is the appeal for anyone anywhere to do something is an act of desperation, right? It's a reflection of their weakness, not their strength. So we have to be very careful when we talk about somebody who answers that appeal to not do what ISIS wants us to do, which is to make believe that they actually are that strong and that there actually is a connection and this person actually was ISIS, rather than some misanthrope who was reaching out for whatever was going to get him in the newspaper and on TV. And if we reward this behavior, whether they're reaching out to ISIS like Omar Mateen was doing or reaching out to white supremacist groups like Dylan Roof was doing, you're giving them an opportunity to be famous and to be a soldier of whatever the cause is. And we need to be very moderate in how we talk about this thing. So we're focusing on real conspiracies, because then, as we've seen, co-conspirators can go out and commit other crimes. But if we're talking about somebody just claiming allegiance with no actual connection, I think we should be very careful in actually attributing that to the group that they claim.
Senator,
Yes, Mr. Jasser.
if I can address something I think is really very, very important, is that, ISIS taking credit is sort of like the rooster taking credit for the morning, and that they will put out the virus out there. These are not lone wolves. It's a global ideology that taps into vulnerable individuals for whatever reason may be vulnerable. But the root cause is, and I think if you look why domestic policy against radical Islam is also connected to our foreign policy, same thing. The vacuum in Syria, you cannot get rid of ISIS in Syria without also ending the Assad regime. The two are two evils that feed off of one another. Secular autocracy and the relationship of this battle within the House of Islam is a cancer that rooted in Syria right now and is spreading all over the planet as they seek recruits, and will take and try to mobilize their recruits they tap into this fervor of political Islam, the allegiance to the Islamic State and that identity. And until we have a coherent domestic and foreign policy with a unifying vision of where we are and the role American Muslims should play in that battle happening within the House of Islam, we're going to continue to see this recur and recur. We could get rid of ISIS tomorrow with 6-month operation to do it in Syria, and it'll come up because the dictators there like to see radical Islam as a foil in order to suppress their populations throughout the Middle East.
I understand. Mr. Haney, were you going to make a point? I saw you leaning forward.
Yes, thank you. During my time as a law enforcement officer, we conducted what we call IDSO, Intelligence-Driven Special Operations. Over the course of 4 or 5 years, I interviewed about 25 to 35 young American citizens who were going to a madrasa in South Africa. And they were in a program called the Alim program. It takes 7 years to go through it, and they become qualified to be imams. They were all Hafiz. They'd all memorized the Quran in madrasas right here in the United States, not overseas. They never finished public school. They memorized the Quran, and when they became graduation high school age, they went to the madrasas in South Africa because they teach in English. I saw it up close and personal with a large cohort of American citizens and or sons of immigrants, still lawful permanent residents. I saw them transform from young men into adults, not only in physical nature, but in terms of their commitment to the ideology that they were studying in South Africa. So I know it's real. That was my specialty. I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of individuals coming back into the United States, both American citizens, lawful permanent residents, and foreign visitors. And virtually every single time, it was exactly the same motivation, commitment to ideology that I saw in every single one of them.
Well, I understand the point that destroying ISIS, destroying the movement of ISIS, destroying the military force of ISIS doesn't destroy the ideology, doesn't destroy the idea. And that's why I asked not just about support, but also inspire, by which I meant ideology as well as potentially recruiting, training, and physically providing support. And I think there are analogies, there have been throughout our history, of forces that want to do us harm through opposing ideology, forces that oppose freedom and democracy, and the values of tolerance and free expression and religious freedom that make us the greatest, strongest country in the history of the world. So that's why I'm looking for evidence that ISIS, as it's constituted now, is providing inspiration and support, because we want to stop not only ISIS, but also whatever it's doing to inspire and support extremism and violent extremism in this country, acts of hate and acts of terror. And Orlando was both. I think the president was right about that fact, and the Attorney General of the United States was right about that fact. And you know, I found Mr. Jasser's point about the responsibility of your effort being bipartisan so compelling. Use that word. And I think it's important that we in the Congress be bipartisan in this effort. And the more we are partisan, the weaker we will be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz. Let me just quickly ask 3 more questions, and then I'm going to conclude if I can. I wanted to follow up a little bit on this idea that ideology is a trigger to violence, and how aggressively or actively we should be going after an ideology rather than actions based on an ideology that Mr. McCarthy suggested. And Mr. McCarthy, I may have misunderstood, but I thought I heard you say that the expansion of the First Amendment in cases during the 1960s to protect radical ideas was a mistake. Is that correct?
I did say that, yes.
Okay. Then let me just, if I could, Mr. Cohen, because
Do you want me to explain what I meant by it, or?
Very concisely, if you would.
Sure. They carved out an exception for the advocacy of ideology that calls for the violent overthrow of the United States, as if there were a firm difference between advocating it and inciting it, which I think has been much more difficult to apply than perhaps they thought.
Mr. Cohen, you've dedicated most of your life to the pursuit of finding and closing down those who engage in not just dangerous ideology, but dangerous actions against other Americans. And Senator Sessions had some interesting, curious comments on the central role of the Southern Poverty Law Center in pushing back against the Klan. And you previously made a point that, just because groups like the Klan, or I would suggest the Lord's Resistance Army, a horrific terrorist group in Central Africa, just because they miscite the Bible, we wouldn't refer to them as radical Christians, and we are similarly making a mistake here if we demonize Islam as radical Islam. Help me understand, in your view, whether we should be engaging in widespread surveillance of the Muslim community, and whether we should be indulging the proposals of some candidates for president in uniform bars on Muslim admission to the United States, or patrols of so-called Muslim neighborhoods, in an effort to contain a dangerous ideology. Where do you think that boundary lies between appropriate investigation of those who might have a proclivity to violence and demeaning an entire religion?
I think we're on a very slippery slope and a very, very dangerous one. If I could respond to one thing that Mr. McCarthy said, and perhaps that will put it into context, the abstract advocacy of violence in our country is constitutionally protected speech. What's not protected is, stealing a group and preparing a group for violence. The first is protected by the First Amendment. The latter is a conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy. I think that if we don't hold that distinction sacred, our country will be in trouble. I think that some of the implicit suggestions that we should surveil entire communities are not only ineffective but wildly un-American, and I can't believe that we would countenance that kind of activity in our country. I think it would drive. I think it would more likely drive terrorism than it would root it out.
Well, that is exactly the challenge I think Senator Klobuchar was referencing in her home community, the challenge of striking a balance between investigating, prosecuting those very few individuals who are committed to acts of violence and breaking up conspiracies, and engaging the much broader Muslim community that is loyal and wants to fully enjoy the freedoms of the United States. And without their partnership and effective intervention of that very small number of folks who want to turn an ideology into an action, is really going to be at some risk. Ms. Kara, there was a previous exchange about the importance of removing from training manuals information that was just bigoted and wildly misleading. If you just renew the point, you asserted in your testimony that stigmatizing and marginalizing an entire community based on their faith both chills our First Amendment and also puts us at risk, because it frays the very relationship between law enforcement and millions of Americans. Would you just elaborate on that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. And specifically on your last point, I think the concern is that if you create mistrust between law enforcement in our communities, people are going to be reluctant to interact with law enforcement and potentially report crimes. And so that means people who are engaging in potential crimes are not going to be caught and brought to justice. So I think there's a real public safety concern there. And specifically, just to kind of tease out what that the concern is that these materials were basically setting up a situation where it was calling for either innocuous activity or religiously First Amendment protected activity to now be seen as an indicator of violence. So, for example, growing a beard, attending a mosque or a prayer group were specific items and behaviors that were listed in an FBI intelligence product as being a so-called indicator of violence.
So, in other words, actions that could equally be indicators of being a faithful Muslim.
Correct.
Or in some people's perspectives could be seen as a gradual movement towards radicalization. Removing that from a training manual makes it more likely that law enforcement agents trying to understand Islam will not make the mistake of assuming that all Muslims are radicalized and are inclining towards a violent ideology.
That is correct.
Is that your basic assertion?
That's correct.
Mr. German, last, if I might just close with you. So the assertion's been made indirectly and then directly that the Obama administration has literally put American lives at risk because of political correctness, or even worse, that career law enforcement agents, because of a fear of somehow being politically incorrect, stepped back from doing their job to keep Americans safe. In the instance of Omar Mateen, he was surveilled several times by FBI agents, both directly and indirectly, undercover agents and folks who were sent in to try and see what he might commit to or what he might do. There's two different possible theories of the case here. One is that the Obama administration is disloyal, treasonous, and putting Americans' safety at risk, and so willfully said, we're not going to take any actions against this dangerous radical. I find that disrespectful to what I know of those in state and local and federal law enforcement I've worked with for many years, who frankly, when they see a clear threat to public safety, don't care about political correctness, they care about doing their job. An alternative theory would be that despite repeated attempts to build a credible case against this individual, he didn't bite. He didn't take action. He didn't actually begin a conspiracy. He didn't take proffered offers of opportunities in a way that allowed agents to build a real case against him and proceed. And as Senator Klobuchar indicated, in one of the largest Muslim American communities in America, they have taken case after case after case to trial and actually successfully prosecuted those who took steps to participate in conspiracies. First, does it seem credible to you that career law enforcement agents look the other way out of a concern for political correctness? Or does it seem more credible to you that a deeply disturbed individual who was at different times saying he supported or was involved with groups that are literally fighting each other on the battlefield, was not taking enough credible steps to develop a working case? And then second, New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton recently said that wide-scale surveillance programs like an NYPD program that targeted the Muslim community failed to produce a single piece of actionable intelligence and frankly didn't work. I'd be interested in your comment on how we could strengthen the hand of federal and local law enforcement to keep us safe.
On your first question, I do believe the men and women of the FBI are doing everything possible under the law to try to protect us from threats. And in the cases where red flags are raised, investigations actually were pursued. My concern is they're not looking for the right thing. They're not looking for indicators of violence. They're looking for indicators of radicalization, depending on whatever model that is. And in some of these cases, what we see is those clear models are not accurate. And I also agree on the issue with Chief Bratton, where the broad surveillance of entire communities dilutes the ability to actually focus on real threats. And I think that's why, during the period those programs were in place, Najib al-Azazi and Faisal Shahzad cases were missed because they were looking too broadly rather than focusing on real threats. In both those cases, they traveled overseas to terrorist training camps. That's something that maybe we should put more resources in rather than surveilling innocent Muslims.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank the whole panel for your testimony, the members of this committee who've engaged today. I do think we have important and unresolved questions about how to keep Americans safe, how to strengthen the hand of federal, state, and local law enforcement, but in a way that respects our most fundamental values and doesn't come up against the boundaries of cherished First Amendment freedoms. And I frankly think whether you call it radical Islam, radical Islamism, Islamic extremism, spending 3 hours arguing about these semantics, in my view, hasn't really moved us any closer towards developing new and more effective ways to combat terror and to defeat ISIS. And I look forward to the upcoming hearing where we will have Secretary Jay Johnson here, and we can both ask more pointed questions about the Department of Homeland Security and the strategy we will all follow going forward. Let me just close by saying that I am deeply troubled by proposals in our current election season. Proposals made by Mr. Trump to ban all Muslims from coming to the United States. Proposals made to keep a list of all Muslims in the United States, to actively and aggressively surveil mosques, to patrol so-called Muslim neighborhoods, I think are profoundly unhelpful as we try to respect America's constitutional traditions and keep our country safe. And I frankly worry that proposals such as these and the broad following they seem to have gotten harken back to some of the worst chapters in American history. In particular, I'll just remind us that after the attack on Pearl Harbor, This great nation turned its back on Japanese Americans, forcing the relocation and incarceration in camps of over 100,000 people based solely on their Japanese ancestry, not based on any actions taken or any expression of intent to harm Americans or to be disloyal to the United States. And the majority of those, in turn, were American citizens. As I prepared for today's hearing, I could not forget a meeting I had with the daughter of Fred Korematsu, whose name was given to a signal U.S. Supreme Court case. I met his daughter at a ceremony at the White House. And in 1983, when Mr. Korematsu's conviction for violating the internment order was finally overturned, he said, and I quote, "I would like to see the government admit they were wrong and do something about it so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color." It is my hope that in this debate and in this election season, we will set aside proposals that seem more in keeping with the errors made in the past, where we went after entire groups of American citizens regardless of their substantive actions, and that we would instead live up to our core constitutional commitments and creed and find the right balance between respecting constitutional liberties, welcoming all Americans of whatever background, and finding a bipartisan path forward that will genuinely keep Americans safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons. I want to thank each of the witnesses for coming and participating in what I believe was a very important hearing. I'm going to very briefly make 3 closing observations. The first, several of my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle made invocations of the Ku Klux Klan and drew the analogy of blaming the Klan on Christians to addressing directly and candidly the threat of jihadism and radical Islamic terrorism. I would hope that all of us on both sides of the aisle could agree that the Ku Klux Klan is bigoted and evil and has no place in civilized society. And I would note the suggestion that could somehow be extended to the Christian faith. Dr. Martin Luther King and many of the civil rights pioneers were Christian ministers, Reverend King, and indeed one of the most powerful paeans to justice ever written, the letter from the Birmingham jail, begins, "My dear fellow clergymen, no faith, whether Christian or Jewish or Muslim or any other, has the right to murder others because they do not share that faith. And we should speak candidly and vigorously against anyone advocating for the murder of innocents because of religious hatred and intolerance." A second observation that is disappointing. After hearing a testimony that include Mr. Haney's testimony that some 876 documents were edited or deleted as a result of a purge, it saddens me that not a single one of my colleagues from the Democratic side of the aisle asked even a single skeptical question about that purge, the purge that resulted in deleting the word jihad, dropping it from 126 in the 9/11 report to 0 in report after report after report, that apparently the Orwellian censorship of law enforcement materials and intelligence materials is not a concern to my colleagues. I would note the Senate has a long history of holding the executive accountable regardless of party. And at a time when we're facing a global war on terror, I hope that my colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle will express real concern about a censorship and editing of law enforcement materials. And the final observation: several times it has been suggested in a nod towards presidential politics, and I understand the lure of senators to inject themselves in presidential politics a few months before a general election may be irresistible, and I wouldn't know anything about that. But yet, not a single one of my Democratic colleagues asked questions or expressed concerns as to why over and over and over again the administration has failed to respond to red flags, failed to respond to real, significant evidence of radical Islamic terrorism before these terror attacks was carried out, and has failed to connect the dots. Law enforcement can't be perfect. We shouldn't hold them to that standard. But it is the obligation of the Senate to hold them in account when over and over and over again, from Little Rock to Fort Worth to Chattanooga to San Bernardino to the Boston Marathon to Fort Hood to Orlando, the red flags are there, the signs are there, and yet the administration doesn't connect the dots and act to prevent those acts of terrorism. It saddens me that not a single question from the Democratic side of the aisle focused on why didn't we do more to prevent these acts of terrorism before they happen. This isn't a question of semantics. This is a question of whether the administration is willing to acknowledge what the threat is and willing to act to prevent acts of murder and terrorism before they occur. With that, I want to once again thank each of the witnesses for being here. We will keep this hearing record open for an additional 5 business days, which means the record will be closed at the end of business on Thursday, July 7th, 2016. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.